Hello everyone, I am the Macabre. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Sit back and relax. The Garden of Whispers, Chapter 1, Flowers of Flesh. The air in the garden felt thick and oppressive, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Agent Andres Velasquez pushed through the overgrown brush, his boots sinking into the damp soil with every step. The place had been abandoned for decades, yet it still pulsed with an unsettling energy. Wild vines crept up the dilapidated fence, and the once vibrant flowers were now ghostly, their colors faded to ghostly hues of purple and brown. The air was thick with a heavy, suffocating sweetness that clung to the skin, as if the earth itself were rotting. Beside him, Marta Ruiz, a criminal psychologist, walked carefully, her eyes scanning the surroundings, her gaze flicking nervously from the towering trees to the dense tangle of foliage. The setting felt wrong. It wasn't just the eerie quiet that seemed to weigh heavily on the air, nor the decaying state of the garden. It was something more visceral, something she couldn't put into words. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It felt alive, as if it were watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. "Over here," Andre said, his voice sharp as he pointed toward a half-buried shape in the undergrowth. A rusted iron gate jutted out from behind a mass of vines, barely visible in the creeping shadows. The air grew colder as they approached the scene. There, just beyond the twisted roots of a nearby tree, was the body. At first glance, it appeared as though someone had left a life-size doll lying among the flowers. But as they got closer, the truth became more grotesque. The body of a young woman lay twisted among the roots of a massive wisteria vine, her limbs unnaturally bent and tangled in the plant's thick, fleshy tendrils. The wisteria itself seemed to be entwined with her, as though it had grown around her in a grotesque imitation of life. Her skin, gray and leathery, had the appearance of something that had been exposed to the elements for far too long. But there was no decay, no putrefaction. Instead, the skin was almost waxy, as if preserved by some unnatural process. The smell was a mixture of damp earth and something far more unsettling, sweet, almost floral, but rancid at the same time. Andres crouched down, examining the body with a practiced eye. His fingers brushed gently against the woman's skin, which felt unnaturally smooth for a corpse. The roots of the wisteria seemed to have penetrated her flesh in places, like veins of some sickly plant growing within her. His stomach turned. "This isn't natural," he murmured, his voice tight with disbelief. Marta knelt beside him, scanning the scene with her sharp, analytical gaze. "This isn't just a murder. It's something else. Something ritualistic." Her voice wavered for just a moment, betraying her discomfort. She had seen countless crime scenes in her career, but this garden, felt different. The way the vines clung to the body alive, moving as if feeding on it, made her skin crawl. As Andres carefully examined the woman's face, he noticed something even more disturbing. Her eyes were wide open, staring vacantly at the sky, but they had not clouded over like a typical corpse's. They were clear, intact, but empty. A hollow, haunting expression. He shuddered. "Whoever did this," he whispered, "they didn't just kill her. They did something far worse." A soft rustling sound from above interrupted his thoughts. Marta looked up instinctively, but all she could see were the thick vines of wisteria hanging overhead, their delicate purple flowers swaying gently in the breeze. The sensation was like being surrounded by something alive, something watching them. And then, from somewhere deep within the garden, came a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A whisper. It was as if the wind itself had carried it, though the breeze was still. A voice, low and urgent, calling to them. Andres stiffened, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked at Marta, his expression darkening. "Did you hear that?" Marta's eyes widened. She hadn't heard a voice, but she had felt it, a presence in the air, something that had brushed against her skin like a cold hand. "We're not alone here," she said softly, barely able to contain her rising panic. This isn't just a crime scene. There's something else happening here." Andres stood up quickly, his hand hovering over his gun. The whisper came again, but this time it was clearer. The words seemed to be calling from the very earth itself. Come, come closer. It beckoned, a voice like the rustling of dry leaves. The garden is waiting, waiting for more. Marta's breath caught in her throat, and she reached out to grab Andres' arm. We need to leave. Now. But as she spoke, she realized it was already too late. The garden was alive, and it had plans for them. Chapter 2. The Cursed Herbarium. The drive to the local library was long and silent. The events in the garden weighed heavily on both Andres and Marta. They had spoken little since leaving the scene, their thoughts consumed by what they had found. The dead woman's body, twisted and preserved in the embrace of the wisteria, haunted them, but there was a growing suspicion that the key to understanding it all lay in the twisted roots of the past. As they arrived, Marta was the first to step out of the vehicle, her mind already racing with questions. The library, an old stone building with ivy creeping up its walls, seemed like a relic from a time long forgotten. It had a musty smell, the scent of old wood and dust mingling in the air. The dim light filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across rows of ancient books. It was the kind of place where the past lived in silence, waiting to be unearthed. The librarian, an elderly woman with silver hair and a sharp gaze, greeted them with little more than a nod. She had been expecting them. Marta wasted no time. She pulled a set of old archives from the shelf and began flipping through them, her fingers brushing over yellowed pages that had not been touched in years. The books were mostly botanical in nature, detailing plants and herbs native to the region, but they were far more than simple field guides. The deeper they delved into the tomes, the more sinister the information became. Strange rituals, ancient rites, and bizarre uses for plants began to emerge, rituals designed to preserve life, to manipulate death, to bind the soul. Meanwhile, Andres wandered toward a smaller section of the library, hidden in a far corner. There, behind a thick veil of dust, was an ancient herbarium. It was an oddity in itself, fragile books bound in leather, their pages thick and yellowed with age, each one cataloging rare and dangerous plants. As he pulled one from the shelf, the faintest trace of a scent wafted into his nostrils. It was sickly sweet, almost overpowering. His fingers trembled as he opened the book. The first page revealed a sketch of a flower, its petals a deep, unnatural shade of red. The description was chilling. Rosa mortis, the death rose. A flower that bloomed in the presence of death. Its petals said to possess the power to preserve flesh indefinitely, binding it to the roots of the earth. Only a specific type of soil could sustain it, and only the soul of the deceased could nourish it. Andres' throat tightened. It was no coincidence. The woman in the garden, fused with the wisteria, was not a random victim. This was the beginning of something much larger and much darker. He flipped through the pages, each illustration more disturbing than the last. Roots that seemed to grow into the bodies of the dead, flowers blooming from eyes and mouths, vines wrapped around torsos like chains. There was mention of a ritual, a ceremony to feed the earth with the remains of the dead, to create a living grave, a place where the soul and body would remain forever connected. The words blurred as his mind reeled, trying to make sense of the horror he was reading. "Hey, Andres." Marta's voice broke through the silence. He turned to find her standing at a large table, her face pale. She held an old, tattered book, its pages filled with strange symbols. "You need to see this." The cover was weathered, but as she flipped through the pages, Andres felt a chill crawl up his spine. It wasn't a botany book, but a grimoire, a book of forbidden knowledge. Marta traced a finger over one of the symbols. It was the same as the one they had found near the first body, an intricate spiral, surrounded by runes and glyphs. The pages were filled with rituals, some of which seemed impossible, as though the text was describing more than just plants. It spoke of soul binding and resurrection. A note in the margin was scribbled in a hurried hand. Only the roots of the wisteria can maintain the balance. If the soul is not preserved, it will claim another. The garden will grow. Andres swallowed hard, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. Do you think he's using these plants to keep them alive? Or is he bringing them back? His voice faltered at the thought of what they were dealing with. They weren't just tracking a murderer. They were tracking someone who believed in the impossible, someone willing to manipulate life and death in ways that defied logic. Marta closed the book with a sharp snap, her expression hardening. "I don't know, but whatever it is, we need to stop him before he creates something worse." The weight of their task felt heavier now, more urgent. There was a deep, gnawing sense of dread settling in her stomach. The thought that this man, this botanist, might be building an army of the dead, bound to the earth in some grotesque symbiosis, made her blood run cold. They gathered their notes, the old books, and the herbarium, carefully tucking them into bags. Andres looked around one last time, as if the walls themselves might be watching them, listening. The library felt too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they stepped out into the fading light of dusk, the air grew colder, and the whispering wind seemed to follow them, swirling around the corners of the library, carrying with it the faintest trace of something sweet, something wrong. They had found the first clues, but the true horror was just beginning. Chapter 3. The Greenhouse of Souls. The air felt heavier as they drove towards the old greenhouse. It stood at the edge of the village, an isolated structure that seemed more like a tomb than a place for cultivation. Its glass panels were cracked and overgrown with vines, the plants inside spilling out like a jungle, consuming everything in its path. The faintest hint of a smell lingered in the air, sharp and floral, yet cloying. It wasn't the pleasant scent of flowers, they could both feel it now. It was something else. Something that made the hairs on the back of Marta's neck stand on end. As they stepped out of the car, the ground beneath their boots crunched unnervingly. It was covered in layers of dried leaves and decaying vegetation. There was a certain silence here too, one that was different from the oppressive quiet of the garden. This silence felt pregnant, waiting. The greenhouse, once a place of botanical wonder, now felt like a mausoleum for the living and the dead. Marta felt an unease creep up her spine. "Do you think he's been living here?" she asked, though the words didn't seem to make sense, even as they left her mouth. Andres didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the building. The once clear glass now showed a thick veil of grime, and dark stains marked the corners, as if something or someone had been keeping it hidden from the world. He stepped toward the entrance, his steps measured. The door was slightly ajar, an invitation or a warning, it was hard to tell. He pushed it open cautiously, and the soft groan of the hinges made Marta flinch. Inside, the temperature dropped instantly. It was as though the very air had been trapped in here for years, stale and heavy, refusing to circulate. The greenhouse had become a tangle of chaos. Plants grew wildly, their tendrils snaking up broken frames, wrapping around shattered glass. Strange, bulbous flowers hung from the walls, their petals dark and almost black at the tips. But what made Marta's stomach churn wasn't the wild growth. It was the presence of photographs pinned to the walls, yellowed and curling at the edges. Each one was of a woman, some of them familiar from the previous crime scenes, others unknown. But in each photo, the women had the same vacant, hollow eyes. Marta's breath caught in her throat. She took a step forward, squinting at the pictures. They had all been in the garden, or near it, at some point. They were the missing women, the ones no one could find. And now they were here, in this greenhouse, like specimens to be studied, their final moments captured in these photographs. Andres moved to her side, his face grim as he too took in the horrific display. "These are the victims, but why are they here?" Marta whispered, her voice barely audible. The faintest echo of a rustling sound in the far corner made both of them freeze. It was the sound of something alive, something moving in the shadows. Andres's hand instinctively went to his weapon, but before he could draw it, a figure stepped into view from behind the thick foliage. It was an elderly man, hunched and gaunt, with pale, sickly skin that seemed too tight against his bones. His hair was long, unkempt and graying, and his eyes, those eyes were wild but oddly serene, as though he had transcended the world around him. He smiled at them, but there was something unsettling about it. It was a smile that lacked warmth, the smile of someone who had lost their grasp on reality. "You've come," the man said softly, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "I've been waiting." Andres stepped back, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But he couldn't take his eyes off the man or the plants around him. The air here was thick with them, and it was as though the greenhouse itself were breathing, alive with some unnatural rhythm. "Who are you?" Marta asked, her voice firm but betraying her unease. The man chuckled, his lips pulling back in a grotesque grin that stretched too wide. "I am the keeper of life," he said cryptically, "the guardian of beauty. These flowers, they know the secrets of eternity." He gestured toward the walls, his hands trembling slightly as if with reverence. Andres took another cautious step forward. "What do you mean? What are these plants?" The old man turned slowly, his gaze lingering on the grotesque flowers, their thick petals curling like hands reaching out for the light. "These are the eternal blooms," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "They hold the power to preserve, to keep what is lost." His eyes met theirs, and for a moment they felt a chill. "I've learned the secrets of the garden," he continued, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But there is a price for such knowledge, a price you may not be willing to pay." Marta exchanged a glance with Andres, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked again, but the man only smiled and began to shuffle toward a workbench at the far end of the greenhouse. The table was cluttered with jars, vials, and what looked like old medical instruments. Strange, translucent fluids bubbled in glass containers, and in the center of the table was a large, open book, its pages covered in a mixture of botanical sketches and more of those cryptic symbols. Andres's eyes narrowed as he moved closer to the book. He could make out a section that detailed various rituals, all of them focusing on the preservation of human life, the binding of a soul to the earth. Some of the plants were clearly noted as being essential for these rites: wisteria, death's rose, and a strange vine that looked like it might have been grown in the depths of some dark, forgotten forest. The more he read, the more it became clear. The man in front of them wasn't just a gardener. He was the architect of something far darker. As Marta took a step forward, her foot caught on something soft. She looked down to see a bundle of dark, twisted roots lying on the floor, their tendrils still faintly twitching. She recoiled in horror as she realized they were human fingers, bound together in the soil, slowly decomposing. "We have to stop him," she said, her voice rising in urgency. But the man only smiled again, as though he had been expecting this. "The garden will continue to grow," he whispered, almost lovingly, his eyes glowing with a fanatic light. "And when it blooms, so will the souls of those who have been chosen." Chapter 4. The Whisper of Clara. The chill of the greenhouse still clung to them when they left. Despite the urgency to leave the cursed building, they couldn't escape the weight of what they'd uncovered. The man, now revealed to be the keeper of the garden, had spoken of things that shouldn't be, things that pressed against the boundary between life and death. But the finality of his cryptic warning echoed louder in Andres's mind. The garden will continue to grow. There was no doubt now that the killer was more than a man. He was a force, a conductor of rituals long buried in the earth. Their car ride back was silent. Neither of them spoke, though Marta's fingers were tightly clenched around the notes they had gathered. She tried to piece it all together in her mind, but it felt like chasing shadows. The victims, the rituals, the strange link between botany and the human soul, how did it all connect? Why were these women being chosen? And why did the garden seem to have a will of its own? As they pulled up to their temporary headquarters, a small police station just outside the village, Marta's phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't know why, but the sudden unease was immediate. With a sharp breath, she opened the message. It was a voice memo, a recording. She clicked play. The sound of static crackled in her ears before a voice, a soft, trembling voice, broke through. "Please, you have to listen. I'm still here." The voice cut off abruptly, then came back, more urgent. "Clara, the wisteria. It's growing through me. It's taking me. Please, save me." Marta's blood ran cold. She recognized the voice. It was Clara Torres, one of the missing women, the one they had identified just days earlier as a victim. But her body was found in the wisteria-covered garden, already dead, or so they had thought. The implication was clear now. Clara had been alive long enough to record this, alive when they had believed her to be long gone. "Clara," Marta whispered under her breath, her mind racing. This is impossible." She, she's still alive. She was alive when we found her. Andres was already reaching for the phone in her hand. He listened to the recording, his jaw tightening. This doesn't make sense. She was supposed to be... He stopped himself, trying to shake off the image of Clara's lifeless body, curled among the wisteria roots, her eyes hollow, her skin tight and waxy. Marta's fingers trembled as she replayed the message, but this time, she caught something else, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It sounded like a plea, a desperate whisper under Clara's voice. It was as if someone or something else had been there with her, a shadow in the background, an entity watching her final moments. The thought made Marta's skin crawl. She didn't die when we thought, she said, barely able to make sense of the words. She was trapped in that garden. The weight of the revelation crushed her. What if all the bodies were not as dead as they seemed? What if the garden was doing something to them, changing them, keeping them alive in ways they couldn't understand? Clara was trying to tell us something, Andres muttered, his eyes narrowing. We need to find her now. They wasted no time. The rest of the evening was a blur of phone calls, searching the last known locations of Clara and the other victims, tracing the path of the wisteria and its tendrils as they spread across the village. They had to find her before it was too late, before the garden claimed another life, or worse, all the lives it had already taken. By the time night fell, they found themselves standing at the edge of the village again, this time facing a decrepit mansion. It was the same one where Clara had lived, though it had been abandoned for years. The local residents spoke of it in hushed tones, as if it were haunted by the memory of something unspeakable. It had once been a home, but now it was just another shadow in the growing darkness, overshadowed by the overwhelming presence of the garden. The mansion's exterior was crumbling, windows boarded up, but Marta and Andres had no choice but to enter. They had no leads left, no other path to follow. The only thing left to do was listen to Clara's final message and see if it led them somewhere, anywhere where they might still find her. Inside, the air smelled of rot and neglect, though there was something else buried beneath it, a lingering scent that Marta could only describe as sweet, the same scent she had noticed in the garden. Her skin prickled as she looked around, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But they pressed on, moving cautiously through the dust-covered halls. A faint sound echoed from upstairs. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Someone or something was here. And then, almost imperceptibly, the faintest whisper broke through the silence. "Help me." It was Clara's voice again. She was close, but so too was something else, something darker. They climbed the stairs quickly, their hearts pounding, every step feeling heavier than the last. As they reached the top, the whisper grew louder, more desperate. It led them to a room at the far end of the hallway, a room that hadn't been opened in years. The door creaked ominously as Andres pushed it open, revealing an old bedroom, the furniture draped in thick sheets of dust. But the center of the room was what made Marta's breath catch in her throat. Clara was there, but not as they had expected. She was alive, her body contorted and bound by vines, the same vines from the garden. Her eyes were wide and filled with terror, but her body was covered in something unnatural. A soft, glowing light emanated from beneath her skin, as if the garden itself was inside her. She looked at them, her lips trembling. "It's too late. The garden. It's taking me." Chapter 5. The Ritual of the Seeds. The sight of Clara, her body consumed by the wisteria vines, lingered in Marta's mind as they left the mansion. The air was thick with a sense of dread, heavy and palpable. Clara had been alive, yet she had not truly been living. It was as if the garden had claimed her soul, binding her to the earth in some horrible parasitic relationship. Her whisper had been a warning, but it had come too late. "Do you think she's going to survive?" Marta asked, her voice barely above a whisper as they walked back to their car. She could hardly look at Andres, afraid that if she did, she would see the same despair reflected in his eyes. The garden was growing stronger, feeding off of the life it stole, and they were no closer to understanding what had started it all. Andres clenched his jaw. "I don't know," he said, his tone heavy with resignation. "But we need answers. We can't just leave her like that, and we can't leave the others to suffer the same fate." They both knew the truth, though neither wanted to say it aloud. The garden was not just a place where people died. It was a place where they were changed, transformed into something else. Clara's body, what remained of it, was proof of that. Back at their temporary headquarters, Marta's phone rang, snapping them both out of their spiraling thoughts. It was a call from the forensics lab. She answered quickly, her fingers trembling as she pressed the phone to her ear. "We found something." The voice on the other end said, "Urgent. It's not just the bodies. We found seeds embedded in the organs of the victims. They were planted inside, during or after death. We think these seeds are key." "Seeds?" Marta echoed, feeling a shiver of revulsion. "What kind of seeds?" The voice hesitated for a moment, and then continued. "They're from a plant we've never seen before. The roots seem unnatural. They grow like nothing we've encountered. These seeds were planted in the hearts, the lungs, the stomachs. Some of the seeds were still viable, even after the decomposition of the bodies." Marta exchanged a glance with Andres, who looked as if the weight of the discovery had struck him too. "Could these be connected to the garden?" he asked, his voice low. "It's more than that," the forensics tech replied. "We're sending you the results now, but we believe these seeds are what allow the garden to grow and what keeps the bodies alive in some sense. They may be responsible for the preservation of the victims. For the unnatural way they seem to remain in some form of limbo." The voice on the other end was almost shaking with unease. "If you don't stop this, I'm afraid the next victim might not just be dead. They might come back." Marta felt a knot tighten in her chest as she looked at Andres. The connection was undeniable now. The seeds were the catalyst, the source of the garden's twisted power. They had to act quickly before it was too late. "We'll be there soon," Marta said, ending the call. She and Andres exchanged a grim look before rushing out the door. The clock was ticking. The forensics lab was located on the outskirts of town, a sterile building that felt more like a morgue than a place of scientific inquiry. Inside, the sterile white walls and the cold metallic tables only heightened the sense of unease. The lab technician, a man in his 40s with dark circles under his eyes, led them to a back room. The atmosphere here felt different, charged, as if something was just waiting to be uncovered. On a workbench in the center of the room, a jar containing the seeds rested beneath a microscope. The lab technician looked at them with a mixture of fascination and horror. "These are what you need to see," he said, pulling the jar closer. The seeds were dark, almost obsidian in color, and each one was irregularly shaped, their surfaces smooth yet pulsing with an eerie, unnatural life. There was no visible way to tell what kind of plant they belonged to, but their aura suggested something far older than any species cataloged in the most ancient texts. The technician gestured toward a second jar, this one containing the remains of a victim's organs, preserved in a viscous liquid. The seeds were embedded within, their tendrils slowly wrapping around the tissue as though they were feeding on it. They don't belong to any known plant," the technician said, his voice quivering. "And yet they're thriving in human flesh." His hand shook slightly as he adjusted the microscope. "There's something deeply wrong here. If these seeds are allowed to grow, they could change the ecosystem entirely. This is something far beyond botany. It's necrotic." Marta felt the bile rise in her throat. "So it's not just the bodies, it's the plants that are alive too. They're using the bodies as fertilizer. The garden feeds off of them, and the victims aren't fully dead." "That's right," the technician said gravely. "These seeds are the key to the ritual. They're planted in the bodies, and from there they begin their life cycle. As the roots take hold, they restore the body to a form of life, one that's tethered to the earth. The only way to stop it is to burn the garden to the ground. But that may not even be enough." Marta's heart sank. If the plants were alive, if the ritual had already begun, burning the garden wouldn't be enough. There were still victims trapped in its grip, souls suspended in limbo. The real horror was not just the deaths, it was the unholy resurrection that followed. "We have to stop him," Andres said, his voice hard with resolve, "before he can plant any more." "But how?" Marta asked, her thoughts racing. "We don't even know the full extent of the ritual yet. What if it's already too late? We find the source. We stop the ritual at its roots." Andres' eyes were determined. "And we burn it all down." As they left the lab, the weight of their task loomed over them, darker than ever. The ritual had already begun, and now it was a race against time. The garden was spreading, its roots reaching deep into the very heart of the village. There was no escaping it. The only option was to fight fire with fire. But the seeds, those cursed, unearthly seeds, were their biggest weapon and their most dangerous enemy. Chapter 6. The Ghost Botanist. The following days felt like an unrelenting descent into the unknown. They had learned enough to know that the garden wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing organism, a perverse manifestation of nature's most twisted possibilities. But the more they uncovered, the more the edges of reality seemed to blur. The garden's influence stretched beyond the dead, beyond the victims' bodies. It had a hold on the living too, on their minds, their perceptions, even their very souls. Marta sat in her office, reviewing the case files, but the reports were starting to feel irrelevant. None of it made sense in the way it should. The more she read about the victims and their connections to the botanic world, the more confused she became. Why these women? Why were they the ones chosen? The garden's influence was too vast, too intricate. Every clue felt like it raised more questions than answers. A knock on the door snapped her from her thoughts. It was Andres, his face pale, his expression unreadable. "We've got a lead," he said, his voice tight. "There's someone you need to meet." Marta raised an eyebrow, but she stood up nonetheless. "Who?" she asked. "A local," Andres replied. "Says he saw something. Someone he thinks might be the key to all this." And so they drove to the outskirts of the village again, this time to an old run-down cabin nestled in a clearing far from the main road. The air around the cabin was thick with the scent of decay, like something that had been forgotten by time. As they approached, Marta couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The trees surrounding the cabin seemed unnaturally still, their branches heavy with dark moss. Inside the cabin, they found an old man hunched over a table cluttered with half-finished sketches of plants, drawings that looked like they belonged in some ancient botany book. His hair was long, wild, and streaked with gray, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. His eyes were wide, sunken, and filled with a kind of feverish intensity, as though he had been peering into the void for far too long. "I knew you'd come," the man rasped as they entered. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. "I've seen him. I've seen the one who's been doing this." Marta stepped forward, her instincts telling her to proceed with caution. "You've seen him?" she asked. "The killer? Who is he?" The old man's gaze flickered briefly to the corner of the room before he turned back to them, his eyes filled with dread. "He's not just a man," he whispered. "He's a ghost, or something worse." Andres exchanged a skeptical glance with Marta, but the old man continued without waiting for a response. "Years ago I found him out there, in the garden. He wasn't a man like you and me. He had the eyes of a predator, but his face, it wasn't right." The old man's hands trembled as he reached for a map that lay in front of him. "He told me he was the keeper of life, the one who had learned how to preserve it beyond death. He spoke of ancient rites, rituals older than anything I had ever heard of. He claimed that the garden could give life eternal." The mention of the garden made Marta's heart race, and she leaned forward, eager for more details. "What happened? Did you see him again?" The old man's expression darkened, his hands shaking more violently now. "I tried to stop him," he whispered. "I couldn't. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I found out too late. He's not just a man. He's a part of the garden, a spirit bound to it. He can't die. He never will." Marta's breath caught in her throat. A spirit? Bound to the garden? The idea was too fantastical, too unbelievable. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. The garden had a power that defied logic. It wasn't simply a place of death. It was a place of rebirth, of preservation, and that power could come from nowhere but the darkest of rituals. "What are you telling me?" Andres demanded. His voice was hard, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You're saying the killer is some sort of ghost?" The old man nodded slowly. "Yes," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "I saw him myself. He's not human. He can't be. The way he moves, like he's part of the earth itself. Like the garden is his soul, his body. He's a living nightmare, and he won't stop until he's finished." Marta's mind raced. Could it be true? Could this killer, this so-called botanist, really be some sort of undead creature bound to the garden? It seemed impossible, yet everything about the case had been impossible from the start. The old man handed them the map, his fingers brushing against Marta's in a moment of contact that felt far too cold. "Follow this," he said. "It's the location of the first garden, the one where he started it all, the one where his rituals began." Andres took the map from the man, his expression unreadable. "Where is this?" he asked. But the old man didn't answer directly. Instead, he pointed toward the forest beyond the cabin, his eyes wide with fear. "There's a place in those woods," he whispered. "A hollow, where the earth is alive with the power of the garden. It's there you'll find him. But be warned, once you enter, there's no coming back." Marta felt a chill settle in her chest as she took the map from Andres' hands. It was only a few hours until dark, and already the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky. She looked at the old man one last time, seeing the terror etched into his face. Whatever they were about to face, it was far worse than they had imagined. They left the cabin in silence, the weight of the old man's words pressing on them like a stone. As they stepped into the car, Marta glanced at Andres. "What if he's telling the truth?" she asked quietly. "What if there really is something more to this than we realize?" Andres didn't respond immediately. He just stared out at the forest ahead, his hands tight on the wheel. "Then we'll stop it," he said, "one way or another." The journey to the location marked on the map was long and treacherous, winding deeper into the wilderness than Marta had anticipated. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches thick and oppressive, as if the forest itself was trying to keep them away. It wasn't until the first light of the moon began to creep over the horizon that they finally arrived at the clearing. The ground here was soft, almost spongy, and the air smelled faintly of earth and something sweeter, like decaying flowers. The garden was silent, but Marta could feel its pulse beneath her feet. It was alive. And whatever had begun here, they were about to face the heart of it. Chapter 7. The Harvest of Blood. The forest was eerily quiet as Marta and Andres stepped cautiously into the clearing. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the earth. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of something ancient and unnatural. Marta felt it as soon as her boots sank into the damp soil. The ground beneath her feet was alive, but not in any normal way. There was a pulse to the earth, a rhythm that was too steady, too deliberate. It was as if the garden itself was breathing, waiting for something. Ahead, the garden stretched out in front of them, an overgrown mass of vines and twisted plants, all choked with the scent of death and sweetness. The trees were thick, their trunks twisted and gnarled, and the flowers that bloomed in their midst seemed wrong, their colors too bright, their shapes too perfect. There were no insects here, no animals, only the oppressive silence of the garden, the stillness that clung to the air like a heavy fog. Andres glanced around, his eyes narrowing. "This is it," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where it all started." Marta nodded, feeling a cold shiver run down her spine. The place felt wrong. She had seen death before, had faced it in its many forms, but there was something about this place that felt like it was pushing against her very soul. It wasn't just the dead bodies that had been found here. It was the garden itself, the way it seemed to have a life of its own. And as they moved deeper into the clearing, she could feel that life felt it reach for them, twisting through the air like invisible tendrils. There was something watching them, something that wasn't quite human. Marta couldn't explain it, but the sensation was impossible to ignore. She could hear the soft rustle of leaves, the gentle creak of vines shifting in the wind. But it wasn't the wind, it was something else. Something alive. And then, as they reached the center of the clearing, they saw it. At first, it looked like a man, but as Marta and Andres approached, they saw the truth. He wasn't a man at all. The figure in front of them was clad in tattered clothing, a long coat of dark, rotting fabric that hung loosely from his thin frame. His skin was deathly pale, his eyes wide and wild, like a hunter waiting to strike. His hair, long and tangled, fell in greasy strands around his face. And though his appearance was almost human, there was something off about him, something primal, something wrong. The figure stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, like someone who had all the time in the world. His eyes fixed on Marta and Andres, and for a moment they both felt the weight of his gaze, a gaze that seemed to look through them, to something far beyond their physical form. His lips parted, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. "You've come," the man rasped, his voice hoarse but somehow soothing, as if it was wrapped in the promise of something comforting, though it was anything but. "You've come to see what I've created. You've come to see the true beauty of life, the one that doesn't fade, the one that lasts forever." Marta's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to back away, to run, but her body was frozen in place, rooted by some invisible force. The man, if he was even a man, was not alone. Behind him, creeping out of the ground itself, were the bodies of the victims. They were no longer fully human, not in any traditional sense. Their skin had been stretched and hardened by the influence of the garden, their bodies warped by the ritual. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their lips, though frozen in death, twitched as if they were trying to speak. "They are my creations," the man continued, his voice a low murmur now. "Each one of them brought back to life through the garden. I have learned the secrets, the forgotten rites of the ancients, the ones who knew how to preserve life, to make it eternal." His eyes gleamed with something otherworldly, a deep hunger that made Marta's stomach twist. "I am the keeper of life, the guardian of the garden, and you are trespassing in my domain." Andres, still frozen for a moment, was the first to snap out of it. He reached for his gun, his fingers trembling as he gripped the handle. "We're not here to admire your work," he said, his voice cold, authoritative. "We're here to stop you." The man, no, the creature laughed softly, a sound that echoed through the clearing like the rustling of dead leaves. "You can't stop me," he said, his eyes darkening. "This garden will continue to grow, to expand. It cannot be destroyed, not by fire, not by weapon. I have made it my own. I have become part of it. It feeds me. It gives me life. And soon, it will give all of you life as well." Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, the earth shuddering as if it was waking from a long slumber. The wisteria vines, thick and twisting, began to move, slithering through the air like serpents, reaching toward Marta and Andres with a deadly intent. The bodies of the victims shifted, their eyes snapping open, their mouths stretching into grotesque smiles. Marta's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. The garden wasn't just feeding off of them. It was growing, feeding off of the very life force of anyone who dared to enter. She could see the seeds now, tiny buds growing in the corpse's hands, in the roots that spread out from beneath the soil like fingers grasping at their flesh. The ritual was far from over. It had only just begun. "They will be reborn," the keeper whispered, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "The blood of the living will feed the soil. The roots will grow deep into the earth, and soon we will have more. You are already part of it, already claimed." Before Marta could respond, the first vine shot forward, its thorns glistening like knives in the moonlight. Andres fired his gun, but the bullet merely passed through the vine as if it was nothing. The vine recoiled and then lunged again, wrapping around his wrist with terrifying speed. Marta drew her gun, but she didn't fire. There was no point. This wasn't something that could be stopped by force. This was a force of nature, something far older and more powerful than anything they had ever faced. The garden, the keeper, the bodies, it was all part of the same sickening ritual. And the longer they stayed, the more they became part of it too. Chapter 8. Roots of Madness. The vine tightened around Andres' wrist, pulling him forward with an unnatural strength that made him gasp. His gun slipped from his hand as the tendrils dug into his flesh, and for a moment, Marta couldn't move. She felt the crushing weight of helplessness press against her chest as the wisteria vines hissed, their movement almost serpentine in its grace. Every instinct screamed at her to act, but the sight of the bodies rising, their eyes empty yet filled with a kind of hunger, kept her paralyzed with fear. "No!" Andres' voice came out in a strangled cry, but before Marta could reach him, the keeper raised a hand, the motion deliberate, almost graceful, like a conductor guiding an orchestra. The vines stopped, their grip slackening, but Andres was still held fast. His eyes met Marta's, and in them she saw not just fear but something deeper, a dawning realization that the garden was not only alive in a physical sense, but also in a psychological one. This place didn't just twist the flesh, it twisted the mind. You see, the keeper's voice was soft, almost soothing. This garden is not simply a collection of plants. It is a reflection of the mind, of the soul. It shows you what you are, what you could be, and what you fear the most. He took a slow, deliberate step toward them, his eyes locked on Marta. This is the true beauty of life. The beauty that never fades. The beauty that doesn't die. Marta's heart pounded in her chest as the keeper's words sank into her mind. They felt like whispers, not just in her ears, but in her very thoughts. It was as if the garden was reading her, reaching deep inside her, touching parts of her psyche she had long since buried. She felt a sudden surge of doubt, a creeping unease that threatened to unravel her sense of self. What if he was right? What if death wasn't the end? What if the garden could offer something more? A part of her recoiled in terror, while another part was inexplicably drawn to the idea. The ground beneath their feet shifted, the earth itself seeming to swell as if it had a heartbeat. The bodies of the victims stood fully upright now, their eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The vines coiled and uncoiled, spreading outwards as if they were searching, probing, testing the air. The keeper's smile stretched wider, a grotesque thing, as if he could sense the battle taking place in Marta's mind. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked, his voice low and coaxing. "The garden calls to you. It wants you. You and your friend. It has tasted your fear, your pain, and now it wants you to be a part of it forever." Marta fought to maintain control, but the whispering in her mind grew louder. It wasn't just the keeper's voice. It was the garden itself, seeping into her thoughts, pulling at her memories, at her deepest insecurities. The pain of her past, the regrets, the guilt, it all surged forward, demanding her attention. She saw her mother's face, ashen and cold, the way she had looked in her final moments. She remembered the faces of her old colleagues, people she'd failed to save, each of them now twisted in agony, their eyes filled with the same hunger that now burned in the keeper's. And then she saw Clara. Clara's face, pale and frozen in death, appeared before her, her eyes wide with terror as the vines crept toward her. Marta felt her breath catch in her throat as Clara whispered her name, her voice thin and strained as if she were speaking from a great distance. "Help me," Clara's voice echoed in Marta's mind. "The garden, it won't let me go. I'm trapped here." Marta's heart skipped a beat, the words hitting her like a blow. Clara was still alive, or at least partially alive. Trapped in the garden's grip, she was no longer human but something else, something that existed between life and death. The realization shook Marta to her core. If Clara could be saved, if any of them could be, they had to stop the keeper. But how? The keeper chuckled darkly, his voice like the rustling of leaves in a storm. "You don't understand, do you? The garden doesn't want to hurt you. It wants to save you. It wants to preserve your beauty, your soul, for all eternity. The ritual is complete. You are already part of it." Suddenly, the ground beneath Marta's feet cracked, and a wave of nausea hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled, her hands bracing against the soil as the world seemed to tilt around her. The garden was alive, not just with plants, but with consciousness, a sentient force that had fed on the deaths of countless souls and now sought to claim theirs. The keeper raised his arms, and with a sudden, sharp motion, the vines lunged forward again, this time not just to trap them, but to consume them. Marta's skin crawled as the tendrils reached out, their thorns like claws scraping across her arms. She could feel the garden pulling at her, its roots wrapping around her body, tightening, suffocating. She gasped for air, struggling against the hold, but it was no use. The more she fought, the tighter the vines became. "Don't fight it," the keeper whispered, his voice like a lover's caress. "Join us. You'll never be alone again. You'll never have to fear death, fear decay. You'll be eternal, just like the garden." Marta could feel her vision swimming, her mind teetering on the edge of madness as the vines pulled her deeper into the earth. She could hear the cries of the other victims, their voices now a chorus of mournful whispers, their minds broken by the garden's insidious influence. The garden had claimed them, twisted them, and now it wanted to claim her too. But then, through the haze of her thoughts, a single clear thought broke through the madness. She couldn't give in. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance to stop this. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Marta raised her gun and aimed it at the keeper. Her hand trembled, but she didn't hesitate. This was their only chance. She pulled the trigger. Chapter 9. The Last Fertilizer. The gunshot echoed through the garden like the crack of thunder, and for a split second time seemed to freeze. The keeper's eyes widened, and his lips curled into a twisted smile, as though he had expected this all along. The bullet, aimed directly at his chest, passed through him like mist, not even slowing his movement. The keeper raised a hand, and with a single, fluid motion, the vine around Andres' wrist snapped like a whip, sending him sprawling to the ground. The earth trembled beneath them, as though the garden itself was reacting to the defiance. "You think you can stop me?" The keeper's voice was low, mocking. "You think that a single bullet will end this?" His hand flicked toward the ground, and the vines recoiled, pulling back from Marta like a retreating storm. She stood frozen, her gun still aimed, but she felt the weight of defeat pressing down on her chest. The keeper's laughter filled the clearing, a sound that made her blood run cold. "You don't understand, do you?" The keeper continued, his voice dripping with amusement. "The garden is more than just a collection of plants. It is a living organism, a vast, sentient force that transcends time, space, and death itself. And I am its caretaker, its soul. You are not the first to try and stop me, and you won't be the last." Marta could feel the vines creeping toward her once more, their touch now gentle but insistent, like an embrace she couldn't escape. The air around her thickened, her senses dulled, and it took every ounce of willpower not to succumb to the garden's influence. The keeper's words were like a song that wormed its way into her thoughts, trying to lull her into submission. And she knew with a sickening certainty that if she gave in, if she allowed herself to believe him, there would be no going back. Andres had managed to scramble to his feet, his face pale but resolute. He gripped his side, where a jagged vine had slashed him open, and staggered toward Marta. "We can't fight this like we thought," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low and strained. "It's not just about bullets. It's about stopping the ritual. We need to destroy the heart of the garden." Marta's mind raced. He was right. The keeper wasn't just a maniacal killer. He was a part of this place, a manifestation of the garden itself. The ritual he had set into motion was ancient, rooted in forces older than anything they could comprehend. And if they didn't stop him, the garden would continue to grow, its roots spreading further, consuming everything in its path. "The heart of the garden," Marta repeated, trying to steady her breath. "But where is it? How do we find it?" The keeper's eyes glittered with a malicious kind of glee as he watched them struggle. "You think you can destroy what you do not understand?" he said, his voice tinged with contempt. "The heart is already here, already planted in the very soil beneath your feet. You have no idea how deep it runs, how far its roots stretch. To destroy it would mean destroying everything, your bodies, your minds, your souls. You would be nothing but dust scattered in the wind." Marta's hand tightened around her gun. "We'll take that risk," she said, her voice sharp with determination. She wasn't going to let him win, not like this. Andres staggered forward, his eyes scanning the ground as if searching for something. "The seeds," he murmured. "The seeds in the bodies. That's how it's growing, how it's spreading. The bodies are just vessels. The real power is in the seeds." Marta's blood ran cold at the realization. Of course, the bodies had been used as fertilizer, their remains incorporated into the garden's soil, their life force sustaining the garden's twisted growth. But that meant the seeds were more than just a part of the ritual, they were its fuel. And if they could destroy them, they might just be able to stop the garden from consuming them all. She turned to face the keeper, her eyes narrowed. "You've been using the bodies as fertilizer. You've been feeding the garden with them." The keeper's expression twisted into a smile that was nothing short of monstrous. "Yes," he said, savoring each word. "But not just any bodies. The chosen bodies, the purest of them. The ones who still have something to offer. The ones who can grow new life. Your bodies, your souls, they will become part of it all too. The last fertilizer. The ultimate harvest." The words hung in the air, like a death sentence. The keeper's plan wasn't just about preserving life, it was about replacing it. He was using the souls of the dead to feed the garden, to fuel his twisted eternal cycle. And once he had harvested enough, once the garden had consumed enough, it would be complete. Marta felt a surge of adrenaline as the full weight of the situation hit her. They had to stop him, not just to save themselves, but to save everyone. If they failed, the garden would continue to grow, its roots spreading across the land, suffocating everything in its path, claiming every living soul as part of its sick, endless cycle. "We have to find the seeds," Marta said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming fear. "And we have to destroy them. Now." Andres nodded, though his face was pale and drawn with pain. He was still bleeding, the wound in his side deep and raw, but there was no time to focus on that now. Together, they moved toward the center of the clearing, their footsteps slow and deliberate, as the garden seemed to shift around them. The vines writhed beneath their feet, as if aware of their intent, and the ground seemed to pulse with a sickly rhythm. The keeper made no move to stop them. Instead, he stood back, watching them with a twisted amusement, as though he were watching the final, futile struggle of doomed creatures. "We cannot stop what is inevitable," he said softly. "The garden will always grow, and you will become part of it, just like everyone else." But Marta refused to listen. She could feel the garden's roots beneath the soil, pulsing with a malevolent energy that sent chills up her spine. She didn't know how long they had before the keeper's power grew too strong to stop, but she knew that they didn't have much time left. And then they found it. At the center of the clearing, beneath a pile of twisted roots, lay the heart of the garden, a large pulsating mass of dark swollen seeds, wrapped in a cocoon of living vines. Marta's heart sank as she approached it, the air around her thick with the garden's power. If they didn't destroy it, if they didn't sever the roots now, it would be too late. With a final desperate cry, she raised her gun and fired. Chapter 10. The Garden That Breathes. The bullet flew through the air, striking the heart of the garden with a resounding crack. The seeds, massive, black, and slick with the blood of countless victims, shuddered as if they were alive. The vines that had been creeping toward them recoiled, their twisted forms writhing in the air like snakes. For a moment, Marta and Andres stood in stunned silence, watching the violent ripple of energy as the garden seemed to convulse in agony. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the night air became thick with a sharp, acrid stench, the unmistakable smell of decay. Then, without warning, the garden erupted in a frenzy. The earth split open, and from the cracks hundreds of tendrils shot up, their tips dripping with dark sap, their roots wriggling like living creatures. The keeper, who had been watching them with a cold, detached smile, let out a low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from deep within the very heart of the garden. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling satisfaction as he stepped forward, his body now fully part of the garden, his limbs stretching unnaturally like vines. "You fools," the keeper spat, his voice distorted and hollow. "You think you can destroy it? You think you can stop it with a bullet?" He raised his arms to the sky, and the garden seemed to respond in kind. The vines twisted and churned, forming into shapes shadows of people, their faces frozen in screams, their limbs stiff and unnatural. The keeper's voice was now a low, haunting chant, a litany that blended with the garden's mournful wail. "The garden lives, and it has lived long before you, and it will live long after you are dust." Marta's heart pounded in her chest as the tendrils closed in, their thorns slicing the air with a sickening hiss. She could feel the weight of the keeper's words, and in that moment, she realized the true extent of their failure. They hadn't just been fighting against a madman. They had been fighting against something far older and far more powerful, an entity that existed outside of human comprehension, a living, breathing force that was both garden and god, death and life, all rolled into one. The keeper wasn't just a man driven mad by obsession. He was a conduit, an avatar of the garden itself. Andres stumbled beside her, his hand clutching his bleeding side, but his eyes were fixed on the keeper, unwavering. He was weakened, but not yet broken. "We still have one chance," he muttered through clenched teeth. "We have to burn it. Burn the garden before it consumes everything." Marta turned to him, desperation flooding her chest. "But how? The bullets didn't work, and we can't even get close without being torn apart by those vines. What can we do?" Andres, his voice ragged, glanced around, his eyes scanning the clearing, the twisted shapes of the victims now completely overtaken by the garden. The keeper's chant grew louder, a rhythmic dirge that seemed to vibrate in the very air. The heart of the garden, Andre said. It's not just the seeds. The source, the soil beneath. It's in the roots. We have to destroy everything. Marta's mind raced. The keeper's words echoed in her ears, and she could feel the oppressive weight of the garden closing in around her. The vines were everywhere now, their tendrils moving like living things, testing the air, sensing their every move. Everything, she whispered. But how? We're out of time. Then, in that moment of desperation, Marta noticed something. A glimmer in the air, a strange flicker of light that seemed to pulse beneath the surface of the ground. The garden, the keeper, the vines, they all seemed to be drawn toward it, as if it were the source of their power. Without thinking, she moved toward it, her legs unsteady but determined. Andres, though he could barely stand, followed her, knowing that this was their last chance. As they approached the center of the clearing, the light grew brighter, its intensity almost blinding. The earth beneath them was soft now, like wet clay, and as Marta knelt down, she could feel the pulse of the garden beneath her fingers. It was alive. She could feel the garden's hunger, its thirst for more death, more life, more of everything that could be consumed. And at the center of it all, she saw it, a dark, writhing mass of roots and vines, all twisting around a central glowing core, a pulsing orb that was the true heart of the garden. Without thinking, Marta grabbed the nearest tool she could find, a broken branch, and plunged it into the glowing mass. The reaction was immediate. The garden screamed. The vines jerked and recoiled, and the ground cracked open as though the earth itself were tearing apart. The keeper's eyes widened, his voice now a scream of rage and agony. "No!" he cried, reaching for them, but it was too late. The core exploded in a burst of light, blinding them both. Marta felt herself thrown back, her body crashing into the ground as the earth shook violently beneath her. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness, the world spinning around her in dizzying circles. When the light faded, the garden was gone. The vines had withered and turned to dust, the twisted shapes of the victims crumbling into nothingness. The ground, once thick with the pulsating energy of the garden, was now silent, still, dead. The air, once heavy with the scent of rot and decay, was now clean, free of the suffocating weight that had filled it before. Marta sat up, blinking against the sudden clarity. Her hands were covered in dirt and blood, her body bruised and battered, but she was alive. Andres was lying a few feet away, his face pale but his eyes open. He was breathing, weakly, but alive. "We did it," Marta whispered, the words tasting foreign in her mouth, as if she were trying to convince herself. "We stopped it." Andres gave her a weak smile, his breath shallow. "For now," he rasped. "But I think it's only just begun." Marta frowned, unsure of what he meant. And then, looking around at the empty, still clearing, the full weight of their victory and the cost of it began to settle in. The garden had been destroyed, yes, but the truth was that it was never gone. It had been alive for centuries. It had been breathing before they had arrived, and it would keep breathing long after they were gone. The keeper had been but one part of it, and no matter how much they had fought, they couldn't destroy what was so deeply rooted in the world. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Marta stood, dusting herself off. The silence that hung in the air was almost peaceful, but deep in her heart, she knew the garden would return. It would always return. And the next time, it might not be so easy to stop. The Breath Collector. Chapter 1. The First Breath. The fog had settled heavily over the French Quarter, cloaking the city in a damp, eerie quiet. It was as though New Orleans itself was trying to hide its sins, tucking them away beneath a veil of mist. The narrow alleyways, lined with faded pastel-colored buildings, seemed to stretch endlessly, and there, at the far end of one such lane, a body lay motionless, almost too still. Dr. Elena Marlowe, forensic pathologist and skeptic, walked toward the scene, the sound of her boots muffled by the thick fog. Her team was already at work, setting up a perimeter, but the stillness of the scene unsettled her. The body of the woman was sprawled on the cobblestone pavement, her face frozen in an expression of sheer terror, her mouth slightly parted as if she had been about to scream but had been silenced in the most unnatural of ways. The victim's clothes, an elegant black jazz singer's dress, were wrinkled, but there was no sign of struggle. There was no blood, no obvious wound. It was as if the woman had simply fallen to the ground, lifeless. But as Elena knelt closer, the sight that greeted her made her breath catch in her throat. The victim's lips were sealed with thick black wax, the kind that looked ancient, like something used in old, forgotten rituals. But it was what was missing that caught Elena's attention most of all. Her lungs, she whispered under her breath. They're gone. The chest cavity, normally so full of life and breath, was empty, utterly empty, as if someone had surgically removed the lungs while the woman was still alive. Elena's pulse quickened, and she scanned the area, searching for any sign of a weapon, a struggle, something, anything, but there was nothing. The scene was too pristine, too deliberate. She stood up and surveyed the surroundings again. The street was narrow, the shadows long in the early morning light. Not a single passerby had been in sight when the body was discovered. The absence of any physical struggle made the situation even more puzzling. Whoever had done this, Elena thought, was no ordinary killer. This isn't a typical homicide, she muttered, mostly to herself. Her thoughts raced, connecting dots that didn't quite make sense yet. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. At that moment, the sound of footsteps broke the tension. A figure approached through the mist, a man with a camera hanging around his neck. It was Jake Morrow, the journalist obsessed with the paranormal. Elena had met him a few times before, but never in a situation like this. He was a tabloid reporter with a reputation for sensationalism and a penchant for chasing ghost stories and urban legends. Dr. Marlowe. Jake greeted her with a wide grin, already pulling out his recorder. What have we got here? Another unsolved death case? Or is it something more supernatural? Elena gave him a sharp look. It's not a joke, Jake. This woman is dead. Her lungs have been removed, and her mouth is sealed with some kind of ritualistic wax. There's nothing natural about this. She motioned for him to step aside, but Jake was already too interested in his camera, clicking away as if the sight before him was just another opportunity for his next big scoop. I'm going to need you to stay out of the way, Elena said, her voice steady but cold. She had no patience for him today, not with this kind of case, but Jake was undeterred. He stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. Look, Doc, he said, lowering his voice. I've been hearing whispers about this for days. People are saying the victims are being suffocated by something beyond our understanding. You don't think this could be connected to those ghost sightings in the city, do you? Elena glanced at the body again, her mind processing the implications of what Jake had just suggested. The last breath of the victim, she muttered under her breath. If someone is using something as simple as a breath to kill. She frowned. The thought made her uneasy, but there was more. She noticed a faint pattern of dried herbs and ash along the victim's arms. A ritualistic mark, but one that was unfamiliar to her. These aren't just ordinary herbs. They're used in certain kinds of... She stopped herself before she could finish. The last thing she needed was to entertain the idea of something supernatural. Before she could voice another concern, Jake suddenly spoke up again, his face a mix of excitement and fear. I recorded something. Earlier, when I was setting up my camera, there was a noise, a whisper. It sounds like the woman's last breath, like something was exhaled right before she died. You should listen. Jake handed her the recorder, his eyes wide. Elena hesitated, but then took it, her curiosity getting the best of her. She pressed play. The sound that came through the recorder was faint, barely audible beneath the sounds of the city. But it was there, a soft, almost imperceptible exhale, followed by a strange gurgling sound as though the woman was choking. What the hell is that? Elena muttered, shivering despite herself. Jake was already scribbling notes furiously. That's the last breath, Dr. Marlowe. That's what I'm talking about. There's something about this case, something we're not seeing. People are dying, but they're not just being killed, they're being suffocated by something unseen, something we can't even understand, and it's leaving a mark. Elena handed back the recorder, her expression darkening. I don't know what you're getting at, but there's a scientific explanation for this. I just have to find it. Yet, deep down, a part of her wondered if Jake was right. If what they were dealing with wasn't just a killer, but something far darker, something that didn't fit neatly into her world of science and reason. The sound of a siren in the distance pulled her back to the present. Elena gave one last look at the body, then turned to her team, who were now beginning to gather more evidence. "Get ready for an autopsy," she said, her voice firm. "I have a feeling this is just the beginning of something much worse." Chapter 2. The Offering of the Dead. The oppressive weight of the fog lingered in the air as Elena and her team made their way to the cemetery. The body of the jazz singer had been taken to the morgue for further examination, but already the investigation was taking a strange turn. The scene at the alley was unsettling, but Elena knew that the next step in this investigation would take them further into uncharted territory. The thought of the ritualistic markings on the victim's skin had gnawed at her all night. There was something here that didn't belong, something ancient, something otherworldly. They arrived at the cemetery just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the rows of weathered gravestones. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, the kind of smell that hinted at secrets long buried. Elena had been to this cemetery before, but never in such an eerie context. As she stepped over the uneven ground, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. Something about this place seemed wrong in a way that was hard to define. Her team spread out, checking the graves and tombs for anything unusual. It was Jake who found it, his voice rising in excitement from the back of the cemetery. "Dr. Marlowe, you need to see this." Elena rushed over, her heart pounding in her chest. Jake was standing in front of a small, secluded mausoleum, its iron gate slightly ajar. Beyond it, she could see a makeshift altar set up in the middle of the crypt, surrounded by candles, skulls, and strange symbols painted in red on the stone walls. It was an offering of sorts. Elena stepped forward cautiously, her eyes scanning the altar. The air felt thicker here, almost suffocating, as if the place itself was holding its breath. The altar was cluttered with jars, each one filled with a murky liquid. A closer look revealed that the jars were labeled with names Aliento de Maria, Aliento de Samuel, and others. Breath of Mary, Breath of Samuel. Elena frowned, her mind racing. What is this? Why would someone be collecting breaths? Jake pulled out his camera and began filming, the click of the shutter echoing in the silence of the crypt. "This is the kind of thing that's been happening all over the city, Dr. Marlowe. The police have been tight-lipped about it, but I've heard rumors of strange rituals, of people vanishing without a trace. This is something else." Elena stepped closer to the altar, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She carefully picked up one of the jars, examining it. The liquid inside shimmered with an almost ethereal glow, and for a moment, Elena could swear she saw something moving within it, a faint, dark mist that seemed to pulse and twist. "This isn't just some sick fetish. These are people's last breaths." Her voice faltered slightly, but she regained her composure. "This is some kind of ritual, and it's connected to the deaths." Her thoughts were interrupted by a low sound from behind her, the creaking of a door opening. She turned sharply, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. In the shadowed doorway of the mausoleum stood a figure tall, cloaked, and eerily still. "Who are you?" Elena demanded, her voice steady but her heart racing. The figure didn't move. Then, in a voice as cold and silent as the grave, the figure spoke. "Santos," he said, his voice barely audible, as though it came from the very depths of the earth. "Santos el Silencioso." He stepped forward, revealing his face pale, with deep-set eyes that seemed to see right through her. His expression was emotionless, like that of a man who had long since given up on the world around him. Elena took a step back, sensing danger, but the figure made no move to approach her. Jake, ever the opportunist, stepped forward, his camera still rolling. "Santos," he said, his voice more curious than cautious. "You're the one who's been seen near the crime scenes, aren't you? The one they say works for Lazaro Obatala." The figure remained silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if the question was irrelevant to him. "Lazaro," Elena murmured under her breath, piecing together what little she knew. "He's the Santero, the one connected to the rituals, the one who believes in collecting breaths." Santos' eyes flickered for a brief second, but his face remained as unreadable as stone. Elena could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. The crypt seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Why? Elena finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why are you doing this? What is Lazaro trying to do? Santos turned his head slightly, as if pondering whether to answer. When he spoke, his words were slow, deliberate. To bring her back, he said, his voice soft but filled with an eerie finality. To bring her back from the dead. For a moment, Elena thought he was referring to someone else, but then she realized he was talking about Lazaro's daughter, the one who had died long ago. The very reason Lazaro had turned to this dark path in the first place. Before Elena could respond, Santos turned and walked deeper into the crypt, his footsteps barely audible on the stone floor. She watched him disappear into the shadows, a feeling of dread settling deep within her gut. This is just the beginning, she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. We've only scratched the surface. As she stood there, the wind picked up outside, rattling the iron gates of the mausoleum. Jake, still recording, stepped up beside her, his excitement palpable. This is huge, Dr. Marlowe. We've got proof now, proof that Lazaro is behind all of this. We have to follow him, find out where he's taking these breaths. Elena looked at Jake, her mind already racing with the possibilities. They had found something that no one had seen before, something that defied logic, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That someone was waiting for them to make the next move. Chapter 3. The Market of Whispers. The evening air in New Orleans had a way of feeling thick, almost viscous, as if every breath you took pulled you deeper into something unknown. After their unsettling discovery in the cemetery, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn toward a place they weren't supposed to go. She had been following the trail of ritualistic clues, but the more she learned, the less she understood. The jars labeled with aliento were only the beginning. If these people, these practitioners of some kind of dark magic, could really collect the last breath of a dying person, what else were they capable of? Elena, Jake, and 2 officers from the local precinct made their way through the maze of the quarter, winding through narrow streets that seemed to narrow even further as they passed. There was a shop they'd been told about, tucked away in a hidden corner of the city, a place where people went to buy things that couldn't be explained. The rumors were that it was a market of sorts, one that sold more than just trinkets and herbs. People who practiced Santeria, and even darker arts, frequented the place. Elena wasn't sure what she expected, but as they reached the alley where the shop stood, something in the air shifted. The temperature seemed to drop, and the shadows in the alley seemed to lengthen unnaturally. The shop's exterior was old, covered in grime, with a faded wooden sign that read La Casa de los Susurros, the House of Whispers. The name alone made Elena uneasy. She glanced at Jake, who was practically vibrating with excitement, but she was resolute. This wasn't the time for him to gawk or record every moment. This was about finding answers, and she had to maintain control. As the group stepped inside, the sound of a bell above the door chimed, its sound far too loud for the cramped, dimly lit interior. The air smelled of incense and something sweeter, something almost intoxicating. The shop was filled with shelves, stacked high with bottles, jars, and bundles of dried herbs. The items were arranged haphazardly, with little attention paid to order, yet there was a certain order to the chaos. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, some painted, others carved into the wood. In one corner, there were candles burning, their flames casting dancing shadows across the room. But it wasn't just the strange collection of objects that made Elena feel uneasy, it was the people. A handful of customers, their faces hidden beneath hoods or veils, whispered quietly among themselves, as if they were sharing secrets too dangerous for anyone else to hear. Behind the counter stood a woman, her face serene, almost ethereal, as if untouched by the world. She wore a flowing dress made of black fabric, embroidered with silver symbols Elena didn't recognize. Her eyes, deep, dark, and unblinking, met Elena's with an unsettling intensity. "Can I help you?" Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, something that suggested she knew exactly who they were and why they were here. Elena hesitated for a moment before answering, her instincts telling her to proceed carefully. "We're looking for information about Santeria. We've encountered some disturbing things." The woman's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Disturbing things, you say? She repeated, her gaze drifting toward Jake, who was filming everything with an almost manic enthusiasm. Perhaps you seek answers in the wrong place, or perhaps you've come to the right place. She motioned to the shelves behind her. People come here for many reasons. Some seek protection, some seek power, and some seek to contact those who have passed. Her voice lingered on the last word, like it was a secret only those who had the courage to ask would ever understand. Jake, never one to hold back, stepped forward. We're here because of the deaths, the victims with their lungs removed. We think it's connected to some kind of ritual. You sell amulets, don't you? Amulets that can capture breaths? The woman's smile didn't falter, but there was a brief flicker of something in her eyes, a fleeting shadow that only Elena caught. You're looking for things that don't belong in this world, she said softly. Things that belong to another time, to another realm. Elena leaned in slightly, sensing that they were getting closer to the truth, but the woman seemed to step back, almost as though she was distancing herself from the conversation. I don't sell anything here for the faint of heart, she continued. But if you must know, the amulets you speak of, they are a part of something far more powerful than you can imagine. She paused, and Elena could feel the weight of her words settling in the room. There are those who believe that when the body dies, the soul is free. But what if the soul can be captured? What if the breath of life can be contained? The words hit Elena like a punch to the gut. She had been assuming all along that these were simple murders, horrific, but explainable. Now it was clear that the reality they were facing was something far more complicated, something beyond her understanding. You mean, Elena started, but the woman cut her off with a wave of her hand. Don't misunderstand me. I do not deal in the dark arts, as some might call them. I simply provide what those who seek power need. She walked to a shelf and pulled down a small vial. Inside it, Elena could see a swirling dark mist. But power always comes with a price, the woman added, her tone dropping. And the price here is steep. Some things are meant to stay in the afterlife, not brought back. Jake, of course, was already looking for the next big lead. He was tapping his camera with impatience, clearly eager to move forward. But the amulets, they trap the last breath. How does it work? Where does it go? The woman's expression remained unreadable, but she seemed to sense his growing obsession. You can't trap what doesn't belong to you, she said, her voice colder now. Once you take a life, the soul, the breath, they are no longer yours to control. And those who try, she trailed off, her gaze flicking toward the back of the shop, where shadows seemed to dance like living things. Elena could feel the weight of those words sinking into her. She was no longer sure if she was dealing with a maniac, a cult, or something far more terrifying. Tell me more about Lazaro Obatala, she demanded, her voice firm. We know he's connected to all of this. He's the one who... The woman's face darkened instantly. He is the one who believes he can cheat death, she said sharply. But there are consequences. There are always consequences. She reached under the counter and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, Elena could see a strange, intricately carved amulet, a piece of bone threaded through a necklace. It was familiar, like the ones they had found at the crime scenes. This is his, she whispered, her voice barely audible. And if you're not careful, you'll become part of the collection. Elena recoiled slightly, the weight of the warning hanging in the air between them. We're done here, she said, her voice cold and final. But mark my words, we'll be back, and we will stop him. As they turned to leave, the bell above the door rang again, signaling their departure. The woman's voice, almost too soft to hear, reached them just before the door closed. You can't stop what's already been set in motion. Chapter 4. The Autopsy of the Void. The morgue was quiet when Elena arrived. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a harsh glow across the cold, sterile room. The air smelled faintly of formaldehyde and antiseptic, a scent that always seemed to cling to her skin no matter how many times she scrubbed. But today, the familiar surroundings felt more like a tomb than a place of discovery. The weight of the investigation had settled heavily on Elena's shoulders, and as she walked past the rows of stainless steel tables, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was in over her head. The latest victim, a young woman named Emily Ortega, had been found in a vacant apartment near the river. Like the others, Her lungs were missing, and her mouth had been sealed with black wax, just like the jazz singer they had discovered days earlier. But there was something different about this one. Elena could feel it as soon as she walked into the autopsy room. The body was laid out on the slab, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones, her face frozen in an expression of pain. As Elena moved closer, she noticed the strange, almost imperceptible marks on Emily's neck, thin, almost invisible lines like needle pricks. "What do you think?" one of the other forensic pathologists, Dr. Harold, asked, breaking the silence. He was already wearing his gloves, ready to begin the examination. Elena didn't answer right away. Her mind was racing with questions. There was no sign of physical struggle on the body, no bruises or cuts that would suggest an attack. The wax seal over Emily's mouth was flawless, as if it had been applied with surgical precision. But it was the missing lungs that bothered her the most. There was no logical explanation for it. No rational reason why someone would take them, unless there was something more to it than just a simple murder. Elena stepped back, trying to steady her thoughts. "We need to check her blood," she said finally. "I want to know if there's anything in there, anything that might tell us how she died before her lungs were taken." "Doctor," Harold nodded and began preparing the necessary equipment. As he worked, Elena ran her fingers through her hair, her thoughts swirling. This wasn't just a murder, this was a ritual. She knew it now, with a certainty that sent a shiver down her spine. But the question was, what was the ritual for? What was the ultimate goal? As they began the autopsy, Elena watched closely, her mind sharp and focused. The body was cold to the touch, stiff, almost as if it had been dead for longer than the official time of death indicated. When Dr. Harold made the first incision, Elena's stomach twisted. The blood was dark, thicker than usual, as if it had been coagulating for days. But that wasn't what made her pause. As the chest cavity was opened, a faint, eerie sound filled the room like a soft, echoing sigh. Elena's eyes widened as she stepped closer, peering over Dr. Harold's shoulder. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice tight with disbelief. The sound seemed to pulse from within the chest cavity, a hollow, almost longing breath that had no logical explanation. "Doctor?" Harold looked up at her, his expression puzzled, but when he reached in to remove the lungs, his gloved hands hesitated. There was something strange about the way the organs were situated. "This is not right," he muttered. "These lungs, they're not human." Elena froze, her pulse quickening. She knew he must be mistaken, but when he pulled them out, Elena's worst fears were realized. The lungs were twisted and malformed, blackened and shriveled, like something that had been removed from a body long before its time. But there was something else, something that couldn't be explained by simple necrosis. There was a faint, dark mist rising from the lungs, curling into the air like a wisp of smoke. Elena recoiled, instinctively stepping back from the table. "What is that?" she asked again, her voice rising in pitch. "What the hell is going on here?" Dr. Harold didn't have an answer. He was too focused on the strange mist to say anything coherent. The fog seemed to move, as if it had a life of its own, swirling around the lungs in a hypnotic, almost sentient manner. Elena stepped forward once more, this time cautiously, as if the mist might leap out and engulf her. She couldn't explain it, but she knew that this wasn't natural. It was as if the breath of the dead was somehow still trapped in the body. A thought struck her like a lightning bolt. "The amulets," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "The breath of life? It's not just taken, it's captured." She looked at the body on the table again, then at the strange floating mist. Her mind raced. If Lazzaro Obatala was indeed behind these killings, then this was exactly what he was doing, taking the last breath, trapping it, using it for some dark purpose. But the question remained, why? What could he possibly want with the souls of the dead? And how was he doing it? Elena felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The answers she had been seeking were slipping farther away, just out of reach. As Dr. Harold placed the lungs in a container to send them for further analysis, Elena's thoughts began to piece together something more sinister. "We need to find out more about this mist," she said, her voice firm. "I don't care what it takes, this is no ordinary murder. This is something else." Her hand shook slightly as she wiped her brow, trying to steady herself. The investigation had taken a turn into the supernatural, but Elena was determined to follow the trail wherever it led. even if it meant confronting things she didn't fully understand. "We'll need to run tests on the mist," Dr. Harold said, finally recovering from his shock. "But it might be a while before we get any answers. In the meantime, we should check the lungs of the other victims, see if they have the same characteristics." Elena nodded, her eyes never leaving the body. As she turned to leave the autopsy room, her mind whirred with possibilities. She knew they were no closer to understanding the full scope of what was happening. But one thing was certain: whoever or whatever was behind these killings was using something beyond the physical world. And the race was on to stop it before more lives were taken. As she left the morgue, the chill in the air seemed to follow her. The strange mist from Emily Ortega's lungs lingered in her thoughts. "I will stop this," Elena whispered to herself. "I have to." Chapter 5. The Sixth Breath. Jake's obsession had always been his driving force. As a journalist who thrived on sensational stories, the more bizarre, the better. But there was something about this case, about these deaths, that gnawed at him in a way he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the gory details or the macabre mystery behind the missing lungs. No, it was something else, something deeper. The recordings he had been gathering, those eerie EVP, electronic voice phenomena, sounds, were growing stronger, more distinct. And every time he played back the audio, he could feel the presence of something otherworldly pushing through the static. The voice had started soft, a whisper at the edges of the recordings. But as Jake delved deeper into the haunted spots around the crime scenes, the voices became clearer. Last night, while visiting the abandoned warehouse where the first victim had been found, he had captured something chilling, a faint but unmistakable voice. "He's drowning us," it said. The voice was a woman's, but there was something wrong about it, almost like it wasn't entirely human. Jake had been unable to shake the sound, replaying it over and over. The words seemed to be laced with desperation, and something darker, something that pulled at the very edges of reality. Jake couldn't resist. He needed more. He needed answers, and the only way he knew how to get them was by continuing his investigation, getting closer to the heart of it. That meant visiting the places where these strange events were happening, and pushing deeper into the world of the unknown. He wasn't just reporting anymore. He was seeking something that might not want to be found. And that brought him back to the warehouse, a place that had become central to the trail. The warehouse was a crumbling structure on the edge of the city, isolated from the bustle of the quarter. Its broken windows stared out like hollow eyes, and the eerie stillness that surrounded it felt unnatural. As Jake entered, his flashlight beam cut through the darkness, casting long, skeletal shadows on the walls. The floor creaked underfoot, a stark reminder that this place had been abandoned for years. But something felt different now. It wasn't just decay that filled the air. There was something else, an oppressive weight that pressed down on him with each step. It felt as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. Jake set up his recording equipment near the center of the warehouse, where the first victim had been found. He turned on his EVP recorder, the small device blinking to life in the otherwise silent room. He spoke into the darkness, his voice breaking the quiet like a knife cutting through fog. "If there's anyone here, I want to hear your voice. Tell me what happened. Who is doing this?" He waited, straining to hear anything. The air was thick, the silence suffocating. He could feel the hairs on his neck rise as he stood there, the tension building, but nothing came. Frustrated, Jake sat down against a broken crate and leaned back, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. His mind raced, thinking about the voices he had heard, the ones that were growing clearer with each recording. It was then, in the stillness, that he felt it a shift. A breeze, impossibly cold for a place like this, brushed against his face. His breath hitched. He reached for his camera, setting it to record the room. As he lifted it to his eye, his gaze caught something in the far corner, a shadow, moving unnaturally. It flickered and twisted, just at the edge of his vision. He blinked, but when he focused again, the shadow was gone. His heart hammered in his chest as he stood up, feeling the weight of the room pressing in on him. His pulse quickened, and the air seemed to thicken around him. The EVP recorder still ran, capturing everything, but all Jake could hear now was the sound of his own breath, loud in the silence. That was when it happened, another whisper, clearer than before. This time it wasn't distant or fading. It was right there, as though it was breathing down his neck. He's choking us. All of us. Jake's blood ran cold. The voice was distorted, layered with anguish and something else, a raw, unfiltered emotion. It was as though the very sound of it was tearing through the fabric of the air. The words sent a chill straight down his spine. Who was saying this? And why? His hand shook as he pressed stop on the recorder, but the air didn't feel empty anymore. The silence was no longer a passive void. It was charged, crackling with something alive and restless. Suddenly, he felt a presence. He wasn't alone. His eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there. The temperature dropped further, and Jake's breath became visible, swirling in the air like smoke. What the hell? He muttered, under his breath, his hands instinctively reaching for his phone. But as he turned to leave, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the empty warehouse, and Jake's heart stopped. He spun around, pressing his back against the door. Something was wrong. He wasn't alone. The whispering voices began again, louder now, layered over each other like a chorus of torment. Help us, he's taking us. The words bled together, and Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. The room seemed to close in on him, the shadows warping and twisting as if they were alive. In the dim light, he saw movement again, flickers at the edges of his vision, shadows that weren't quite right. The whispers grew louder, now filling the entire room. His flashlight flickered, casting brief flashes of light on the walls, illuminating strange, fleeting images of figure in the corner, a glimpse of something pale and gaunt, before the shadows swallowed them whole once more. Jake knew something was coming. He wasn't sure what it was, but he could feel it in the air, as if the very walls of the building were closing in around him. He reached for the door again, but it was locked. The whispering continued, growing more frantic. He turned back toward the center of the room, where his camera had fallen to the ground, still recording. The screen flickered, and the image of a dark figure appeared in the lens, just a blur at first, but then clearer. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by shadows. But there was no mistaking the feeling in the room now. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of this part of the ritual. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The air cleared, the whispers faded, and the temperature returned to normal. The lights on Jake's camera blinked out, and for a moment, everything was still, too still. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, but the room seemed impossibly quiet, as though the very air had sucked all the sound from it. The camera lay on the floor, its lens cracked. Jake stood frozen, unsure if what he had just witnessed was real, or if it was a trick of his mind. But the recorder was still on, and as Jake bent down to pick it up, the faintest whisper escaped the device. Sixth breath. The words were barely audible, but they were enough to send a wave of dread crashing over Jake. The sixth breath, he repeated to himself, his voice trembling. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing for certain. They were no longer dealing with a string of murders. They were dealing with something far older, something that had been waiting. Jake didn't stay much longer. His feet moved on their own, and he didn't look back as he hurried out of the warehouse. The recorder clutched tightly in his hand. Whatever had just happened, whatever he had just witnessed, it wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. Chapter 6. The Ritual of the 13 Winds. The investigation was beginning to feel like a puzzle, with more missing pieces than it had any right to. Elena sat at her desk in the coroner's office, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the wood as she stared at the latest batch of autopsy reports. The bodies were all starting to tell a similar story, but there was something else, something that didn't sit right. All of the victims had been suffocated, but in such a precise manner that it didn't seem like an ordinary killing. Their lungs were removed, their mouths sealed in black wax, but there was no sign of force, no sign of a struggle. It wasn't just a murder spree, it was a ritual, a sacrifice. The reports revealed something that only deepened Elena's dread. The lungs of all the victims showed traces of an exotic toxin, a substance that had been used in ancient rituals. But it wasn't just any poison. It was something far older, a substance used by practitioners of African diaspora religions. And that was when she realized the connection to Lazaro Obatala. He wasn't just a Santero, he was a man who had buried himself in ancient rites and forgotten gods. What he was doing had nothing to do with the simple act of killing. It was an invocation, a dark attempt to reach across the veil of death. Elena had heard of the 13 winds before ancient rituals practiced by certain sects of Afro-Caribbean religions, often used in attempts to summon powerful spirits, or even, as legend had it, to raise the dead. The idea was to trap the spirits of the deceased by harnessing their final breath, the very thing Lazaro had been doing. But what shocked her the most was the discovery that Lazaro's goal wasn't just the collection of these souls, it was something far more profound and terrifying. According to the documents she had found, Lazaro was trying to create an army of the dead. The 13 winds ritual required 13 souls to form a bridge between the living and the dead, and Lazaro needed just one more to complete his collection. But there was more. The ritual didn't just require the death of the victims, it demanded the presence of a specific entity, a deity of death. And the deity Lazaro sought was none other than Oya, the Yoruba goddess of winds, transformation, and death. She was said to be the force that carried the souls of the dead to the underworld, a being whose powers were unfathomable. The realization hit Elena like a punch to the gut. Lazaro wasn't simply trying to summon Oya to speak with the dead, he was trying to manipulate her power, to force her to bring someone back. The final breath was more than a ritualistic offering. It was the key to resurrecting his daughter, the girl who had died in a tragic accident years earlier. Lazaro was willing to sacrifice anyone, anything to bring her back. In his mind, each breath he captured was a step closer to that goal. But with each breath, he was also tightening the grip of his own madness. It was then that Elena realized why the victims' mouths had been sealed with black wax. The wax was symbolic, a way to bind their souls, to ensure they couldn't cry out as they died. Their breaths were trapped within them, waiting to be captured, to be absorbed by the amulets Lazaro had been crafting. The amulets were the vessels for the final breaths, and once the last one was collected, the ritual could begin in earnest. The missing lungs were just the start. Jake's voice on the phone interrupted Elena's spiraling thoughts. "I've been to the warehouse," he said, his voice low and strained. "You were right. Something's happening. I don't know if I can explain it, but I saw him. Lazaro. He's planning something big, Elena. He's close to completing it. He needs just one more soul." Elena's heart sank as she listened, her grip tightening on the phone. "Jake, listen to me. You have to stay out of this. It's too dangerous. We need to find out where he's hiding. He can't complete the ritual. Not if we can stop him first." Jake was silent for a moment, the tension palpable even through the phone. "I don't know if I can do that, Elena," he said quietly. "I've seen too much. This is bigger than just a story now. I'm part of it, whether I want to be or not." Elena's hand trembled as she ended the call. She knew Jake was right. He had become entangled in this nightmare, just like everyone else. But that didn't change the fact that Lazaro was close to finishing his ritual, and they were running out of time. Elena's thoughts raced as she gathered her team for a briefing. The investigation had taken a dark turn, and now there was a deadline. Lazaro needed just one more soul to complete his army, and he was willing to sacrifice anyone to get it. The police had already been stretched thin, and they had no idea what they were truly dealing with. But Elena knew now. She knew that this wasn't just a simple case of murder. It was something far more insidious. And the worst part was, the ritual had already begun. The missing lungs, the wax seals, the strange mist, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle. A puzzle that would soon be complete, unless they intervened. "We need to find him," Elena said, her voice cold and firm, "before he kills again, before he completes the ritual." But as she looked around the room, she knew that finding Lazaro wouldn't be easy. He had spent years hiding his true intentions, cloaking himself in the guise of a healer, a santero, a man of faith. But Elena had uncovered his secret. Now, she just had to figure out where he would strike next. The rest of the team nodded grimly, understanding the gravity of the situation. "We'll find him," one of the detectives said. "We'll stop him before he can complete whatever it is he's planning." Elena nodded, but her mind was already moving to the next piece of the puzzle. They needed to find that final victim, the last soul that Lazaro needed. She didn't know who it was, but she knew one thing for sure. They were running out of time. Jake's recordings, his EVP captures, had revealed something crucial. The voices were getting more desperate, more frantic with each passing day. They were no longer just whispers. They were cries for help. The victims were trapped, their final breaths caught between the worlds of the living and the dead, and Lazaro was the key to their torment. If they didn't stop him now, his ritual would be completed, and nothing would be able to stop what came next. Elena stood at the window, looking out over the dark city, her mind heavy with the weight of what they were up against. The ritual of the 13 winds, she whispered to herself, a cold shiver running down her spine. She didn't know if they could stop it, but she had to try, for the sake of the living and the dead. Chapter 7. The Ghost Hospital. The abandoned hospital on the outskirts of New Orleans had been closed for over a decade, its windows boarded up, its iron gates rusted with neglect. Yet despite its desolation, it loomed like a dark sentinel against the night sky. Elena stood before the building, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and determination. The team had traced Lazaro's activities to this place, an old medical facility that had once been a center for experimental surgeries, particularly for those in desperate need of rare and unapproved treatments. It was the kind of place that would have appealed to someone like Lazaro, a man who had once been a respected doctor before his descent into madness. The air around the hospital felt thick, heavy, with the memories of suffering and death. The very walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if something was still alive inside, something that had never truly left. Elena's breath fogged in the cool night air as she stepped through the rusted gate, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. She wasn't sure what she expected to find here, but she knew one thing. This place held the key to understanding Lazaro's descent into madness, and perhaps a way to stop the ritual before it reached its horrifying conclusion. Inside, the hospital was a maze of crumbling hallways and peeling walls. The smell of mildew and decay hung in the air, mixed with something darker, more metallic. Blood? Elena couldn't be sure. She took a deep breath and led the team inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the remnants of what had once been a place of healing. Now it was little more than a tomb abandoned and forgotten, yet alive with the ghosts of its past. They followed a narrow corridor, the walls adorned with faded medical posters and old photographs of patients long dead. Some of the rooms were still equipped with surgical tables covered in dust, but in others, there was something far more disturbing. Strange symbols drawn in the dust on the floors and walls, symbols that matched the markings Elena had seen on the bodies of the victims. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. Lazaro had performed surgeries here, likely on his own patients, before he turned to murder as a means of collecting breaths. In one of the rooms, the team discovered a set of old medical journals, their pages yellowed and brittle with age. As Elena flipped through them, she was horrified to find detailed accounts of experimental surgeries that Lazaro had performed, many of which involved the removal of organs, particularly the lungs. The entries were disturbingly clinical, but as she read further, Elena's stomach turned. It seemed that Lazaro's experiments had been driven by a twisted obsession with the afterlife, with trying to preserve the essence of life itself. He had always believed that the soul resided in the breath, in the lungs, and his surgeries had been an attempt to capture that essence. Then, in the back of the room, something caught her eye. A set of photographs pinned to the wall. They were old and grainy, depicting various patients under the care of Lazaro. Some of the faces were familiar, their expressions frozen in fear. But what chilled Elena to the bone was the last photo, faded and barely visible, but unmistakable. It was a picture of a young girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, and she was hooked up to various medical devices. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The girl looked exactly like Lazaro's daughter, the one who had died years ago in a tragic accident. But this photo was dated years before her death. Lazaro had been experimenting on his own daughter, long before she died. The realization was almost too much to bear. Elena felt a wave of nausea sweep over her as she tried to process the implications. Had he been trying to bring her back even then? Had this obsession with death and resurrection consumed him so completely that it had begun long before the murder started. The team continued to search the hospital, moving from room to room, when they finally stumbled upon something far more horrifying. In the basement, hidden beneath a pile of debris, they found a locked door. The heavy iron bars across it suggested that whatever was behind it had been sealed away for a reason. When they managed to pry the door open, Elena was hit by a wave of cold air as they descended into the darkness below. The basement was a sprawling, underground chamber, its walls lined with shelves filled with glass jars and strange containers. The faint hum of electrical equipment buzzed in the background, but it was the center of the room that froze Elena in place. There, on an old operating table, lay the body of a man, his chest open, his lungs removed. But it wasn't just the body that caught her attention. Above it, suspended in the air, was a glass sphere, containing something that looked like mist, swirling within. The mist moved as though it had a life of its own, as if it were alive. Elena's heart raced. The missing breath. It was here. Santos had to be close. He was the one helping Lazaro gather the souls, and if he was here, then they were running out of time. This was it. This was the place where the ritual was being prepared. The final breath, the last soul, was right in front of them. Elena's mind raced, trying to piece everything together. The sphere, this was the last step. Lazaro was using this facility, the place where he had once performed surgeries on the living and the dead, to complete his ritual. The breath was being captured in this glass container, held in stasis until it could be released in the final act of resurrection. Jake's voice crackled through Elena's earpiece, interrupting her thoughts. "Elena, I think I found it," he said. "There's an altar, a stone table. He's preparing for something big." Elena's pulse quickened. "Jake, get out of there. This is bigger than you realize. Lazaro's close. He's close to finishing the ritual." But it was already too late. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the temperature in the basement plummeted. Elena's flashlight flickered, and the humming of the electrical equipment grew louder, more insistent. The mist inside the sphere began to swirl violently, and Elena could feel the air around her thickening, becoming charged with an unnatural energy. It was happening. Lazaro was completing the ritual. Santos appeared at the doorway, his face grim and cold. Elena's heart stopped as she realized the trap was closing. "You're too late," he whispered, stepping forward into the room. "He has all he needs. The ritual is already in motion." Elena had no choice but to act quickly. "Stop him! We can still stop this!" she shouted. But Santos simply smiled a slow, sadistic grin as he raised his hands. The mist in the sphere began to rise, and the air grew impossibly heavy. Elena's mind raced. There was no more time. They had to finish this now, or they would all be consumed by the storm that was about to be unleashed. Chapter 8. The Trap of Echoes. The darkness in the basement seemed to fold in on itself, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. Elena's heart raced as the mist swirled around the glass sphere, growing in intensity. The ritual had already begun, and there was no time left. As Santos stepped forward, his grim expression twisted with a strange mixture of guilt and devotion, Elena knew they were about to face something far worse than just a murderer. Lazaro had crossed the line between the living and the dead, and now the consequences were impossible to ignore. Elena's mind raced as she reached for her gun. She had no choice but to act fast. "Santos," she shouted, her voice sharp. "If you care about anyone at all, you need to stop him. This is madness." But Santos only shook his head slowly, his eyes hollow, as though he had already given up on the possibility of redemption. "It's too late," he muttered. "You don't understand. This is the only way. He's almost done." Elena felt a cold shiver of dread slither down her spine. It wasn't just Lazaro she had to stop. It was the force he was trying to awaken. Before she could react, a sharp pain lanced through her side. She gasped and looked down to find a needle buried in her skin. Her vision blurred for a moment as the room seemed to tilt, but she forced herself to stay upright. Santos had injected her with something, and she could feel the drug taking effect slowly, imperceptibly, draining her strength. As her body grew heavier, her limbs turned sluggish, and her mind became clouded. She struggled to keep her focus, but the fog in her brain was thickening, wrapping around her thoughts like a suffocating blanket. Santos grabbed her by the arm, lifting her effortlessly as though she weighed nothing. "You don't understand," he said again, his voice softer now, almost pitying. He doesn't want to hurt you. You're just in the way. This has to be done. Elena's breath was shallow as she tried to push herself free, but her body refused to cooperate. The drug was working too quickly. Her vision began to blur again, and her knees buckled beneath her. She wasn't sure if it was the drug or the weight of the situation itself that had her sinking into unconsciousness. "Lazaro, you're wrong," she gasped, but the words came out in a hoarse whisper. "This isn't how you bring her back. She's gone. Let her go." But Santos didn't seem to hear her. He dragged her down the narrow corridor, the walls closing in as they reached the altar room. There, in the center of the chamber, stood Lazaro, his back to her as he prepared for the final act of the ritual. The sphere of mist hovered in midair, the energy in the room growing exponentially. Elena could feel it in her bones, this strange, oppressive force that seemed to weigh on everything. The breath of the dead had been captured, and now it was ready to be unleashed. Lazaro didn't turn around when he heard their footsteps. His voice, low and full of an eerie reverence, filled the room. "You're too late, Elena. The ritual is nearly complete. You can't stop it now." Elena's heart sank, but she still managed to find the strength to speak. "You're wrong, Lazaro. You're not bringing her back. You're just creating a nightmare. This isn't her. It's a distortion, a perversion." His shoulders stiffened, and he slowly turned, his face a mask of quiet rage. For a brief moment, Elena saw something like sorrow flicker in his eyes, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by an unrelenting madness. "You don't understand," Lazaro said, his voice now sharp with anger. "She was taken from me. I will do anything to bring her back. Anything. You have no idea what it's like to lose someone you love like that. To watch them slip away and know there's nothing you can do." His words were almost a whisper, but the room seemed to tremble as he spoke, the very air vibrating with his anguish. Elena struggled against the drug's effects, her vision spinning as she tried to stay focused on him. "You've lost your humanity, Lazaro," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is not love. This is obsession, and it will destroy you." Lazaro's eyes darkened. "And I will destroy anyone who gets in my way," he hissed, his hands raising toward the sphere. The mist inside it began to swirl violently, and Elena felt an overwhelming sense of suffocation. The room seemed to shrink as the air grew heavier and colder. The final breath, the one that would complete the ritual, was just moments away from being released. Santos moved behind Elena, holding her in place as the air around them thickened, the mist pulsing as though it had a life of its own. "You can't stop it," Santos repeated, his voice almost pleading. "There's no turning back now." Elena's mind raced. She couldn't let Lazaro succeed. She couldn't let him unleash whatever force he was attempting to summon. Her hand brushed against the cold metal of her gun, hidden beneath her jacket, and she seized the opportunity. With a desperate surge of strength, she drew it and fired into the air, the shot reverberating through the room like a crack of thunder. The sound of the gunshot seemed to shatter the spell that had held them all in place. Lazaro recoiled as if struck, his hands faltering for a moment. The mist inside the sphere froze, suspended in midair, its swirling motion coming to a halt. The oppressive weight of the room lightened just enough for Elena to gasp for breath, her strength returning in small increments. But it wasn't enough. Lazaro, enraged, turned to her with a snarl, his eyes burning with fury. "You think you can stop this?" he growled. "You think you can stop me from bringing her back?" But before he could make another move, a loud crash echoed from the doorway. The police had arrived. They were too late to prevent the ritual from reaching its climax, but perhaps they could still stop Lazaro. In the chaos that ensued, Elena was able to break free from Santos's grip, her legs finally supporting her weight as she ran toward the altar. The police surged into the room, weapons drawn, but they hesitated as the atmosphere became charged with an overwhelming energy. Elena knew that the only way to stop Lazaro and his twisted ritual was to destroy the glass sphere, the vessel containing the captured breaths. If it shattered, the ritual would collapse, and the force Lazaro had unleashed would dissipate. Without thinking, she grabbed a metal rod from the debris nearby and swung it at the sphere. It hit with a sickening crack, and for a moment, everything stood still. Then, the mist exploded outward in a violent surge, filling the room with an icy wind that sent everyone reeling back. Elena was thrown to the ground, and the last thing she heard was Lazaro's scream, a sound of pure agony, as the ritual was undone. The air seemed to snap back into place, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the room was quiet. Chapter 9. The Last Breath. The air in the room was thick with smoke and the stench of something decaying, as though the very fabric of reality had been stretched too thin. Elena's head was spinning from the violent blast that had come when the glass sphere shattered, but she forced herself to rise. She was still alive, still conscious, but barely. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she struggled to comprehend the chaos unfolding around her. The mist that had once swirled within the sphere was now filling the room like a dense fog, pulsating with an eerie light. Lazaro was writhing on the ground, clutching his head in agony. The energy in the room had shifted, becoming jagged, almost violent, as if the ritual had struck back at its creator. His body convulsed with spasms as if some invisible force were trying to tear him apart. The last breath, the essence he had captured, was now loose, and it was consuming him from the inside out. His eyes, wide with terror, locked onto Elena's for a fleeting moment before they glazed over in a vacant stare. "She's not gone," he whispered, his voice ragged with pain. "She can't be gone." Elena barely managed to stumble to her feet, her body still shaking from the trauma. The police had already rushed into the room, weapons drawn, but they were paralyzed by the unnatural atmosphere. They could feel it too, the sense that something far beyond their understanding had been unleashed. Elena's mind raced. She had seen this before: Lazaro's obsession with the dead, his need to trap the breath of the dying, to bring them back. But this was something worse. This wasn't just about resurrection. This was about control. Lazaro hadn't just been trying to bring his daughter back. He had been trying to master the very essence of life and death. As the mist continued to swirl, Elena felt an overwhelming presence fill the room. It was as if something were watching them, something ancient and furious, something that existed between the worlds of the living and the dead. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being trapped in a web, caught between the veil of life and the endless void of death. She glanced around, searching for an escape, but the very walls seemed to close in on her. She could feel the weight of the ritual hanging in the air, the desperate desire for resurrection. But it wasn't just Lazaro who was at the center of it anymore. It was them all, connected by the breath, the souls, the whispers that now echoed through the room like a storm. One of the officers, a younger man named Martinez, was the first to break the silence. "What the hell is going on? What did he do?" he stammered, his gun trembling in his hand as he scanned the room, clearly terrified by the supernatural forces at play. Elena didn't know how to explain. How could she? How could she make them understand that Lazaro had not only crossed the line between life and death, but had dragged them all into something far darker than any of them could comprehend? The dead were no longer dead. They were here, with them, in the room. The very breath of their last moments was lingering in the air. Suddenly, the mist took shape. It began to condense, forming a figure, and Elena's breath caught in her throat as she saw it. A faint, translucent outline of a little girl, no older than the one in the photograph Lazaro had shown her earlier. She had the same wide, empty eyes that seemed to hold an eternity of sorrow. Her tiny hand reached out toward them, her mouth silently moving as if she were calling for someone, for something. Elena felt a cold sweat break out across her back. The child was not alive. She was a fragment of the past, an echo of death, held together by Lazaro's obsession. But as the mist began to take form, Elena realized something even more horrifying. The child was growing not in body, but in presence. The air around her seemed to distort, the walls warping as though the very space around them were bending under the strain of what was happening. "No," Elena gasped, stumbling forward. "This isn't her. It can't be her." It was then that she understood. Lazaro hadn't just been trying to bring back his daughter. He had been attempting to tear open the boundary between the living and the dead, to merge them, to create an army of the dead who could exist in both realms. The child's form began to flicker in and out of existence, her features shifting, becoming more monstrous with each moment. Her eyes darkened, her once innocent face now twisted with something more malevolent. "No!" Elena shouted, realizing the horrifying truth. "It's not her. It's a creation, a demon born from Lazaro's obsession." It's not her, Lazaro. She's gone. Lazaro's face twisted in anguish, and he scrambled toward the child, his hands reaching out as if he could somehow fix her. She's not gone, he screamed, his voice breaking. I can fix this. I will fix this. But the figure in front of him began to dissipate, the mist swirling around her as though she were dissolving, fading back into the ether. And with it, the force that had been building in the room seemed to shudder. The walls shook, and the ground beneath their feet trembled as if the entire building was about to collapse. It's not too late, Elena said, her voice hoarse but determined. She rushed toward Lazaro, grabbing him by the shoulders and forcing him to look at her. You have to stop. You've opened a door, and if you don't close it, everyone will be lost. Lazaro's eyes widened in confusion and terror as he looked at her. Close it? How? His voice was desperate, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, understanding. He knew what he had done, but it was too late for him. The door was already open. The breath had been taken, the spirit released, and whatever was beyond that threshold would not be easily put back. Then, with a final, thunderous crash, the figure of the girl dissolved completely, and the mist was sucked back into the air as if it had never existed. The oppressive weight in the room lightened, the supernatural force that had filled the space dissipating. But as the last remnants of the mist vanished, Elena realized with horror that the damage had already been done. The line between life and death had been irrevocably shattered. And somewhere, out there, something was waiting. Elena stumbled backward, gasping for air, her body still heavy with exhaustion. The officers were still in shock, their faces pale with fear and disbelief. Is it over? Martinez asked, his voice trembling. Is it over? Elena didn't have an answer. She didn't know if it was over. She only knew that whatever Lazaro had done, the world had just changed forever. Chapter 10. The Army of the Drowned. The storm outside was a maelstrom of wind and rain, as if nature itself had joined the chaos within the building. The last remnants of the ritual hung in the air, the lingering presence of something far darker than they had anticipated. Elena stood at the center of the room, her body still trembling from the aftermath of the supernatural forces she had faced, but her mind sharp with clarity. It wasn't over. The mist had dissipated, the girl's figure had dissolved, but the danger had only just begun. Lazaro had awakened something worse than he could ever have imagined, and now the world was on the brink of disaster. The police had secured the building, but Elena could already hear the distant sound of sirens and the thumping of helicopter blades as the authorities outside scrambled to understand what had happened. It wouldn't be enough. What had been unleashed was beyond the control of anyone but those who had dared to summon it. Elena, Jake's voice came from behind her, his tone strained with urgency. She turned to see him, his camera still in hand, but his expression was far graver than it had ever been before. You need to see this. Jake led her outside into the storm, where the rain pelted them mercilessly. The city, once filled with the rhythm of jazz and the chatter of tourists, now seemed eerily silent. The only sound was the wind and the occasional crack of thunder. What's happening? Elena asked, feeling a cold chill creep down her spine as she scanned the horizon. Something was wrong. The streets, the sky, the very air, everything felt off. Jake pulled out his camera and showed her a recording he had made in the aftermath of the explosion. The footage was grainy and distorted, but there was no mistaking the horrifying sight it revealed. On the screen, a line of figures appeared on the streets of the city, moving with unnatural synchronization. What the hell are those? Elena whispered, her heart pounding in her chest as she recognized the faces. They were the dead, the victims who had been part of Lazaro's ritual. But now they were not just ghosts. They were alive, but not in the way that the living were. They moved like puppets, their eyes hollow, their bodies drenched in a strange, unnatural moisture, as if they had risen from the depths of the sea itself. The alientos, Jake muttered, his voice filled with terror. They were all trapped in those jars, weren't they? All those breaths, all those souls. They were never meant to be released. They're not people anymore. They're an army. Elena could see the figures more clearly now. They were walking through the streets in perfect unison, their heads slightly tilted, their mouths open as though gasping for air. They were the very breath of the dead, brought back to life in an unnatural form, with no purpose but to carry out the will of their creator. Suddenly, a terrible, guttural scream echoed through the streets. Elena spun around, her heart leaping into her throat as she saw more of the figures emerging from the darkness. The storm seemed to swirl around them as if the weather itself was being manipulated by the force Lazaro had unleashed. "We need to stop them," Elena said, her voice determined. "If we don't, they'll spread across the entire city. We need to find Lazaro, stop him before he can unleash more of them." Jake nodded, but his face was pale. "He's gone, Elena. He's not here anymore. He's somewhere else. The storm, the bodies, they're all connected. This wasn't just a ritual to bring his daughter back. This was something else entirely. Something bigger." Before Elena could respond, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. She turned to find Santos standing at the entrance to the building, his hands held out in front of him as if pleading. His face was a mask of despair, his eyes hollow from the strain of what he had witnessed. I didn't want this," he whispered. "I didn't know it would go this far. I never wanted to be a part of this." His voice trembled with guilt. "Lazaro, he's gone. He's dead. But his work isn't finished. It's just begun." Elena's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice hard. "What did Lazaro do? What's happening to the city?" Santos stepped closer, his eyes darting nervously as if he feared being heard. "He didn't just take the last breath of the dead," he explained. "He took something more. He took the essence of life itself, the part that binds us all. And when he released it, he didn't just summon the dead back. He bound them to the world of the living. They're trapped here now, unable to rest. And the only way to stop it is to close the door. But to do that," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Elena's pulse quickened. "To do that?" she said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "What do we need to do, Santos?" Santos looked at her, his expression filled with regret. "We need to destroy the breath. The last one. The one that was used to summon them all. But it's too dangerous. It's not just a matter of closing the door. It's about destroying what's holding them here." His hands trembled, and Elena could see the deep conflict in his eyes. "I can't go back, Elena. I can't undo what I've done. But you can." Elena turned toward Jake, her mind racing. "We don't have much time." She looked at the storm swirling above them, the unnatural dark clouds churning as if the very heavens were protesting. "We need to find that last breath. We need to find Lazaro's final creation and destroy it. Now." The figures continued to march through the streets, their eyes locked on their destination, as if they were being pulled toward it by some unseen force. "We need to hurry," Jake said, his voice taut with fear. "If we don't, the entire city is going to be overrun by them. This isn't just a matter of saving lives anymore. This is about stopping the world from collapsing into the dead." Elena nodded, steeling herself for what was to come. "Then we end this." Now, Obsidian Tears. Chapter 1. The first tier. The Popocatépetl loomed ominously on the horizon, a sleeping giant whose restless slumber had been disturbed more than once by rumblings from deep within. From the base, the mountain looked majestic and dangerous, as it always had. The sky above was a heavy slate gray, and the thick haze of sulfuric smoke, rising from the volcano's fumaroles, gave the air a sickly, metallic scent. Dr. Valeria Rojas, a geologist specializing in toxic minerals, found herself drawn to this very place, though not by curiosity alone. This was work, and it was personal. Valeria stood in front of the research station at the foot of the volcano, her eyes fixed on the towering peak. A feeling of unease gnawed at her, a feeling she hadn't been able to shake since the first phone call had come in. There had been reports, gruesome ones. Bodies were being found around the Popocatépetl, and they were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Petrified corpses, their skin turned to glass, gleaming like obsidian. She had no choice but to investigate, though her heart ached with the weight of old memories. Her father had died in an eruption years ago, and every step toward this mountain felt like a step toward confronting that painful loss. The air was cold and biting as Valeria and her team ascended, their boots crunching on the rocky terrain. The wind howled, pushing against them, but it was the heat that caught her off guard. Despite the chill in the air, a faint warmth radiated from the ground beneath them, as though the very earth was alive, stirring. Her colleague Marco glanced nervously at her. Feels like the volcano's awake today, he said with a half-hearted laugh. But Valeria said nothing, her mind elsewhere. Her fingers, covered in weathered gloves, clutched the strap of her backpack tightly. They moved up slowly, scanning the landscape, eyes darting for any sign of the horrific discovery they had been sent to find. And then, after what seemed like hours of relentless hiking, they spotted it. A figure, standing like a macabre sentinel against the background of the darkening sky. It was a body. But it was not like any body Valeria had seen before. The man had been frozen in time, standing upright with his arms raised toward the heavens, a silent scream forever etched on his face. His skin shimmered, not in a natural human way, but in the eerie sheen of black glass, obsidian. His eyes were hollow, replaced by smooth, dark stone, and his mouth was open, but no sound had escaped. Inside, there were remnants of what appeared to be acid burns. Valeria's breath caught in her throat, and her heart pounded in her chest. She stepped closer, compelled despite herself. Marco reached for her arm, but she shook him off. "What is this?" she murmured under her breath, not expecting an answer, just speaking to the mountain, to the night, to herself. The body had been perfectly preserved, as though some unseen force had turned it to stone. As she crouched beside it, Valeria noted the lack of any obvious external injuries. The skin was glassy and smooth, and the air around the body was unusually warm, as if the temperature rose with proximity. She reached out cautiously, running her gloved fingers over the smooth surface. It was as if the man had been encased in molten rock and then cooled instantaneously, leaving no trace of how it had happened. It's impossible," Valeria whispered. The phenomenon before her was beyond explanation. She had seen volcanic deaths before, but nothing like this. Her mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, none of which made sense. Her hand trembled as she pulled out a small vial from her pack, carefully collecting a sample of the strange black substance that covered the body. If her suspicions were correct, the material was not simply ash or soot, it was something far more dangerous, something only formed under extreme conditions. A strange buzzing sensation filled her head as she stood back, her mind grappling with what she had just witnessed. It was only when Marco spoke again, this time with a tremor in his voice, that she was pulled from her thoughts. "Valeria, we've found something else." Reluctantly she turned, feeling an unsettling twinge in her gut. And there, a few meters away, they found more bodies, more petrified figures, all arranged in a horrific tableau. Some had fallen, their bodies twisted unnaturally, while others had collapsed in place, their gazes frozen in silent horror. Each of them had the same characteristic, obsidian skin, and all of them had one thing in common: remnants of some kind of acid inside their mouths, which had long since dried. It was a chemical burn, but not just any burn. This was something different, something lethal. Valeria's pulse quickened as she crouched near another body, examining the substance. Her mind clicked into overdrive, analyzing the chemical composition, recalling every detail of her training. The acid was unlike anything she had ever encountered. It was far too volatile, and yet it seemed controlled, almost as if someone had deliberately exposed these people to it. The acid could only form under extreme heat, much like the kind produced by a volcanic eruption. But the question remained, who could possibly have orchestrated such a horrifying scene? "Marco," she said slowly, her voice suddenly colder. "We need to call for backup. There's something much bigger going on here than we realize." As they radioed for help, a chill descended upon Valeria's spine. In the distance, beyond the bodies, the volcano rumbled softly, as if in response. The sound was almost alive. The earth beneath her feet trembled slightly, and for a moment, she thought she heard something whispering, something ancient and furious, but it was only the wind. Or was it? As they began their descent, Valeria couldn't shake the feeling that the Popocatépetl had been waiting for them, that something far older and more terrifying than they had imagined was stirring beneath the surface. Chapter 2. The Codex of Fire. The research camp had been set up in the shadow of the Popocatépetl, the air thick with sulfur, but Valeria's mind was 1,000,000 miles away. The bodies they had discovered, their petrified forms, the strange obsidian skin haunted her every thought. Even as the rest of her team analyzed the samples they had collected, Valeria found it hard to focus. She kept seeing the blackened faces of the victims, their hollow eyes staring into the abyss, and hearing the distant rumble of the volcano. It felt as if the very earth was trying to tell her something urgent, something ancient. Itzel, a local guide and descendant of Aztec priests, arrived at the camp with news. She was a young woman with sharp eyes and a quiet strength, carrying with her an old leather-bound book, its cover worn, its pages yellowed with age. The codex, she said, had been in her family for generations. It was a relic, passed down through the years, containing ancient knowledge of the volcano and the sacrifices once made to appease the gods of fire. Itzel had always been cautious about the book, unsure if it was something that should be shared, but now, with the bodies appearing and the volcano's rumblings growing louder, she had decided it was time to speak of its contents. Shutekutli, Itzel began, her voice low and steady as she opened the codex, revealing symbols that looked more like forgotten art than words. The god of fire, the volcano, is his domain, and it has always been so. The Aztecs knew that the mountain must be fed with blood to avoid a cataclysm. It is said that when the gods are angered, the fire will awaken and the land will burn. But when the mountain sleeps, it is a different kind of danger. It waits. Valeria leaned in, studying the symbols carefully. There were intricate depictions of rituals, of offerings made to Shutekutli, blood sacrifices, heart extractions, and the ceremonial feeding of fire. At the center of the codex was a large, ominous inscription: Las lágrimas de la montaña saciarán al Dios, pero si no son dadas, el fuego dormido despertará hambriento. The tears of the mountain will satisfy the god, but if they are not given, the sleeping fire will awaken hungry. What does that mean? Marco asked, his brow furrowing as he peered over Valeria's shoulder. Itzel's eyes darkened. It speaks of a great power that lies beneath the mountain, waiting for the right moment to break free. It tells of a time when the mountain must be fed, or it will destroy everything in its path. And the tears, those are the offerings, the sacrifices. The codex speaks of a warning. The fire may be dormant, but it is never fully asleep. The words sent a chill through Valeria's spine. The idea of a god, a primal force of nature, needing to be fed with human lives, was almost too much to bear. But there was something else in the codex that caught her attention, something more unsettling. There, written in the margins, were several cryptic lines, almost like a prophecy. When the hearts are glass, the fire will cry. When the stone speaks, the god will rise. The hair on the back of Valeria's neck stood up as she read those words aloud. Marco gave her a confused look. What does it mean? Hearts of glass? Stone speaking? Itzel's face was grim. I don't know, but I think it's a warning. Whoever is behind these deaths is recreating the old ways, sacrificing lives to appease something beneath the earth. And if it succeeds, her voice trailed off. We need to find out who's behind this, Valeria said firmly, closing the codex with a snap. And we need to stop them before it's too late. If the codex is right, the eruption will be the least of our worries. Later that night, Valeria couldn't sleep. Her mind churned with the implications of what they had uncovered. Could someone really be trying to bring back an ancient sacrificial ritual? The idea seemed too far-fetched, too insane, and yet, the bodies, they were real. The obsidian skin, the acid burns, it wasn't some twisted fantasy. It was happening right in front of her. As she lay in her tent, staring at the canvas ceiling, she heard a low rumble from the volcano. It was almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. She sat up, listening intently, but the noise faded as quickly as it had come. Her breath quickened. It sounded like something deep inside the volcano was stirring, something primal and ancient. She shook her head. This was madness. The codex was just a story, a myth. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Popocatépetl was alive in ways they couldn't understand, alive and angry. In the morning, they set out to investigate further. Armed with the codex and the new understanding of the ancient rituals, Valeria and her team made their way toward the base of the volcano, hoping to find some clue that would lead them to the person or people behind the deaths. Itzel led the way, her steps sure, though her face remained pale. as if the weight of what they were seeking was too much for her to bear. She spoke little, her eyes darting nervously to the distant peaks, where the air shimmered with heat. But it was when they reached the caves near the crater that they found something truly horrifying. There, nestled in the shadows of the rock, was an altar, a crude structure made of stone and bones, with the unmistakable signs of ritualistic activity. Blood stains, faded but still present, marked the ground. And at the center of the altar, there was an offering, the body of a man, his flesh carved with strange symbols, and his eyes replaced with smooth black stones. Another victim, another sacrifice to the sleeping god. Valeria's stomach churned as she approached the altar. She didn't need to examine the body closely to know that it had been prepared in the same way as the others. And then, her eyes landed on something even more chilling. A small stone idol, resting on the altar. The figure depicted Jutekutli, the god of fire, his arms raised in a mocking gesture of triumph. But it wasn't just the idol's presence that unsettled her. It was the fact that the idol seemed to be watching her. For the first time, Valeria felt the full weight of the prophecy. When the stone speaks, the god will rise. Chapter 3. The laboratory of Hell the Mountain had been silent for days now. The distant rumblings of Popocatépetl had ceased, but the tension in the air was palpable, thick with dread. Every person in the camp could feel it. The heat from the volcano still radiated through the ground, and the smell of sulfur lingered in the air like a constant reminder of the dormant beast watching over them. Valeria could not ignore the nagging feeling that something was being hidden beneath the surface, something far worse than they had yet discovered. The bodies, the rituals, it all pointed to a far more organized force than they had anticipated. Itzel's codex had given them some answers, but those answers only led to more questions. If the ancient Aztec gods required sacrifices to keep the volcano dormant, who would be foolish enough to attempt recreating such a twisted practice in modern times? And why would anyone willingly expose themselves to such extreme dangers, gases, heat, and volcanic eruptions just to complete a ritual? The more Valeria thought about it, the more the only reasonable conclusion began to solidify. Someone had discovered a way to manipulate the volcano, perhaps even control it, using the same rituals but with modern science. We need to find out who's behind this, Valeria said one evening as the team gathered around the fire. If there's a lab out here, a place where someone's been experimenting, we need to find it. We can't just sit here and wait for the next body to turn up. Marco, who had been poring over his notes and samples all day, looked up, his face tense. "There's something I've been meaning to mention," he said slowly. "One of the samples we found on the last body, there was an unusual chemical trace. It's something I've never seen before, but I've been digging through every geological text I can find. It's fluoroantimonic acid." Valeria froze, her eyes narrowing. Fluoroantimonic acid? But that's not something naturally occurring in the environment. No, Marco agreed. It's an extremely rare chemical, one of the most corrosive substances on Earth. It's only produced under intense conditions like, say, those found in a volcanic eruption or in a lab under controlled circumstances. Then it's man-made, Valeria murmured, realization dawning on her. Someone has been using this acid as part of the rituals. This wasn't some accidental death from volcanic gases, it was deliberate. The team packed up quickly and set out toward the area where the bodies had been found, searching for any clues that might lead them to the source of the acid. The air was heavy with the oppressive heat, but it wasn't the weather that made Valeria uncomfortable. It was the creeping sense that they were being watched, that someone or something was out there, just beyond the reach of their lights. They had been walking for hours, following a narrow path along the cliffside, when they stumbled upon it. Hidden beneath the rocky overhang was a cave, its entrance partially obscured by a thick veil of smoke and steam rising from a nearby fumarole. Valeria's heart raced. She could feel at the lab, the answers were inside. As they approached, the heat became unbearable, pressing in on them like a living thing, but Valeria couldn't turn back now. They had to know what was happening. Inside the cave, the temperature was even more oppressive. The walls were slick with moisture, and the air smelled of chemicals, burnt metal, sulfur, and something sweeter, almost like a decaying fruit. The deeper they ventured, the more the sensation of dread grew. until they finally came to a large, open chamber. What they found there nearly stopped Valeria's heart. The room was filled with makeshift laboratory equipment, strange machines that hummed with life, and glass vials filled with various toxic substances. But it wasn't the equipment that shocked Valeria the most. It was the bodies of more victims, arranged in grotesque poses on metal tables, their skin not just covered in obsidian, but in strange, intricate patterns, as if the acid had carved them into grotesque works of art. Their eyes were glassy, their mouths twisted in eternal agony. And standing in the middle of the room, as if waiting for them to arrive, was Teo Zamora, his back to them, looking at a map spread across a table. Valeria's heart dropped. Teo. It was him. She had suspected him for days, but seeing him here, in the heart of this madness, confirmed her worst fears. Teo, she shouted, stepping forward, her voice sharp with accusation. What have you done? What is all of this? Teo slowly turned around, his face expressionless but his eyes burning with an intensity that made Valeria step back. There was something in his gaze, a madness, a conviction that made him look almost unrecognizable. He was no longer the brilliant, if eccentric scientist she had once known. Now he seemed like something else entirely, something consumed by a need that went beyond reason. You don't understand, Valeria, Teo said, his voice soft but firm. The volcano isn't just a mountain, it's a living entity. Shutekutli, the god of fire, he sleeps in the depths, and he demands to be fed. I'm giving him what he needs before he wakes up and destroys everything. This is how it has to be. These sacrifices will keep the balance. I'm doing this to save us all. Valeria shook her head, her mind reeling. This is madness. You've been killing people, turning them to stone just to appease a god that may not even exist. This isn't science, Teo. It's insanity. Teo's lips curled into a strange, almost sad smile. You're still clinging to that outdated notion of logic, Valeria. Science can't explain everything. Not everything can be measured or quantified. There's something ancient in the mountain, something powerful, and I can feel it. If we don't feed it, it will awaken in fury. But the acid, how are you creating it? Marco asked, his voice trembling as he gestured toward the tables and the chemical vials. Teo turned his head slightly, almost as if he were admiring the equipment. It's a byproduct of the volcano's heat. The gas pockets, the fumaroles, they create the perfect conditions. I've refined it, learned to harness it, to create fluoroantimonic acid. It's what gives the bodies their glass-like skin. It's part of the process, the purification of the flesh. Only then can the sacrifices be accepted. Valeria felt a chill crawl up her spine. The laboratory was not just a place of experimentation, it was a place of worship, twisted and corrupted by Teo's obsession. He wasn't just a scientist anymore. He was a zealot, a priest of a dark, unholy ritual that tied him to the volcano, and in his eyes, his madness was a necessary sacrifice. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. Teo believed that by sacrificing others, he could prevent a catastrophe, a fiery wrath that would consume not just the mountain, but the entire world. But in his pursuit of salvation, he had become the very thing that he feared. He was no longer saving lives, he was condemning them, and it was only a matter of time before the volcano and Teo claimed them all. Chapter 4. The Visions from the Summit. The night after their discovery in Teo's underground laboratory, Valeria lay awake in her tent, the image of the petrified bodies haunting her thoughts. Her mind raced with the implications of what they had uncovered. Teo's obsession with the ancient rituals, the acid, the sacrifices, it was all far beyond anything she had ever encountered in her career. And yet, something still gnawed at her. Despite the terrifying evidence, there was one detail that kept surfacing in her mind: the visions. The bodies had been altered in such a way that their expressions were not just signs of agony, but almost like they were seeing something before their deaths, something otherworldly. She sat up in her cot and glanced around the darkened camp. Her colleagues were still asleep, exhausted from the day's journey, but sleep was elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same thing: the faces of the victims, their eyes turned into dark obsidian stones, staring blankly at nothing. But there was something behind those glassy eyes, something in the way they looked past her, something alive. What did they see? Valeria had been trained to separate emotion from science, but this felt different. The sensation that something was watching, something powerful, was so overwhelming that it made her skin crawl. She stood, pulling on her jacket and stepping outside the tent. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but it only made her feel more alive. The mountain, still and quiet, loomed above, an imposing shadow in the darkness. The faint rumbling of the volcano was almost a whisper now, but she could feel the earth shifting beneath her feet. It was as if the volcano itself was breathing, slowly but surely. She walked to the edge of the camp, peering up at the summit. Something about the way the moonlight hit the peak made it appear almost alive. A pulsing glow seemed to emanate from the crater just out of sight. Valeria had been to this mountain a dozen times, but she had never seen it like this, like it was watching, waiting for something. And then she heard it. At first, it was a faint sound, almost like a whisper on the wind. But as it grew louder, Valeria's breath caught in her throat. The voice wasn't human. It was a low, guttural murmur, like the very earth was speaking. She could make out only one word, an ancient sound, a language that sounded so alien to her, yet somehow familiar. Tlakenoli. Valeria stumbled backward, her heart pounding. It was a word from the codex. It meant sacrifice, blood, and fire in the ancient Nahuatl language. She felt the ground tremble beneath her, a low vibration like a pulp, and then, like a flash of lightning, it struck her. The volcano itself was alive, and somehow it was trying to communicate with her. The realization hit her like a wave, drowning her in fear and fascination. Could Teo have been right? Was the mountain truly a living god, one that demanded tribute? As the whispering voice continued, Valeria found herself compelled to climb. Without thinking, she gathered her gear and set off toward the peak. The cold wind cut through her, but she barely noticed. Her footsteps were mechanical, as if her body was being guided by something beyond her control. The higher she ascended, the more the voice seemed to resonate through her bones, vibrating through the very air. It was maddening. It was intoxicating. When she reached a higher ledge, she stopped. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The fumaroles hissed and sputtered, but in the distance, the summit of the volcano seemed to pulse with energy. It was almost as if the peak were breathing, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the whispers in her mind. Valeria could feel her heartbeat quicken, the fear growing in her chest. She felt an overwhelming urge to go further, to reach the top, to see the source of the voice that had become her obsession. But it wasn't just the voice that drew her in. As she looked down at her feet, she saw something else, something even more unsettling. Beneath the ground, hidden in the shadow of the rocks, was a strange pattern in the dirt. At first, it seemed like an ordinary arrangement of stones, but as she crouched down to inspect it, she realized they weren't stones at all. They were bones, human bones, arranged in a deliberate pattern. They formed a circle, with what appeared to be a larger bone at the center, almost like an offering. Her breath caught in her throat. These were not ancient remains. They were fresh, and they were arranged with intent. This was a ritual site. She could feel the heavy weight of the history, the darkness that lingered in this place. As she examined the bones more closely, she noticed that many of them had been treated in the same way as the victims she had seen acid burned, their bones calcified, as if they had been exposed to extreme heat. They had been altered, just like the others. Before she could stand up, a sharp sound echoed through the night, a scream, distant and tortured. It was coming from above her. Valeria's blood ran cold. The scream was unmistakable. It was human. And it was filled with the kind of raw, primal terror that could only come from someone facing their death. With trembling hands, Valeria pulled out her radio, her voice shaky as she called for Marco and the others. "We need to move now. There's someone up here. I don't know who, but they're in danger." But there was no response. The radio was silent. The mountain had swallowed their words. As Valeria hurried up the rocky terrain, her heart racing, the scream echoed again, closer this time, and she could hear a second voice, lower and rasping, as if it were whispering something in return, something that made her blood run colder than the night air. It was in Nahuatl, but it was not a prayer or a plea for help. It was a command, an imperative. Feed him, or the mountain will awake. Valeria's body froze. The scream had ended, but the echoes of the words lingered in her mind, louder now, impossibly louder, almost as if the mountain itself were speaking through the voice. She realized in that moment that whatever she had come to understand about Popocatépetl, about the volcano, about Teo's obsession, was only the beginning. The truth was darker than she could ever have imagined. And the mountain was not just a passive force, it was alive, hungry, and waiting for the next offering. Chapter 5. The ritual of the four winds. Valeria had barely made it back to camp before the air shifted. It was as if the mountain itself had exhaled, sending a wave of heat and sulfurous fumes sweeping over the landscape. The temperature soared, and the familiar smell of volcanic gas became so pungent that it nearly choked her. She stumbled into the camp, her mind reeling from the visions and the horrifying command the mountain had whispered to her. She had heard the words, but the meaning asterisk, "Feed him, or the mountain will awake," echoed relentlessly, tearing at the edges of her sanity. Marco, who had been pacing anxiously near the tents, rushed over to her. His face was pale, eyes wide with concern. "What happened? We heard you calling for help, but I don't know," Valeria interrupted, her voice hoarse. I heard it. The voice. The mountain is alive. It's real, Marco. Teo wasn't just making this up. The volcano is not just a force of nature. It's something more. It's sentient. And it wants blood. Marco blinked, trying to process the words, but his mind couldn't quite catch up with the terror in her voice. The mountain? Sentient? But that's... I saw the remains, Valeria said quickly, trying to gather her thoughts. Not ancient remains, fresh, human bones, arranged in a pattern, a ritual site. And I heard someone scream, and another voice, telling me to feed the god or it would wake up. Marco stepped back, visibly shaken. You're not saying that we're supposed to what? Sacrifice someone to the volcano? I don't know, Valeria said, her breath shallow. But I think Teo's rituals have been part of something bigger, something ancient. The codex, the acid, it's all connected. The sacrifice isn't just symbolic. It's the only way to keep the mountain's hunger at bay. And if we don't do it, I fear the eruption won't be just an eruption. It will be the end of everything. Itzel, who had been listening quietly from a distance, approached them slowly, her face drawn with fear. She had heard the screams as well. Her eyes were dark, filled with a kind of knowing that made Valeria's skin crawl. The ritual, Itzel said softly, almost to herself. The four winds. That is how it begins. Valeria turned sharply toward her. What do you mean? What is this ritual? What's the four winds? Itzel's lips trembled as she spoke. The four winds are the four corners of the earth, the four forces that govern the world. The Aztecs believed that by aligning the sacrifices in the four cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, they could appease the gods and prevent disaster. The wind carries the prayers, the pleas for mercy. But when the sacrifice is done incorrectly, or the balance is disturbed, it awakens the god, Valeria finished, her heart pounding. She had heard the legends, but hearing them from Itzel, in this context, took on a darker weight. The volcano wasn't just a passive player in the game. It was the center of a twisted ritual, a key to some ancient power that Teo had tapped into, whether he understood it fully or not. Teo, Valeria whispered, shaking her head. He must have been trying to complete the ritual. He's been performing sacrifices in the four directions, hasn't he? The bodies, the patterns. The victims were positioned at key points around the volcano. Itzel nodded solemnly. Yes, that is the way. And I think you're right. He's been trying to keep the balance. But in doing so, he may have made things worse. The volcano is a living thing, yes, but the sacrifices cannot be forced. The god cannot be controlled. It will demand its price. We need to stop him, Marco said, his voice low, his hands clenched into fists. If Teo has been performing these sacrifices, it means the volcano is waking up. We can't wait any longer. Valeria felt a sense of dread wash over her. She knew they were running out of time. Teo was dangerously close to completing the ritual, and if he succeeded, there would be no stopping the eruption, no stopping the fury that the volcano would unleash. The mountain wasn't just an eruption waiting to happen. It was the beginning of something much worse. She could feel it in her bones. They began to organize a plan, gathering their equipment and preparing to climb to the highest point of the volcano's rim. It was the last place they hadn't fully explored, the place where Teo had likely completed the final stages of the ritual. The wind had begun to pick up, howling in the distance, and the smell of sulfur grew stronger with each passing hour. The mountain seemed to pulse beneath them, as if it were alive and aware of their every move. By the time they reached the base of the summit, the storm clouds had gathered ominously above them, swirling in a vortex as if the winds themselves were conspiring against them. It was no longer just a storm, it was a sign. The volcano was preparing for something, and Teo, obsessed and determined, had no intention of stopping now. As they made their way up the final stretch of the ridge, the landscape around them began to change. The air grew hotter, the ground more unstable, as if the very earth was shifting beneath their feet. And then, at the peak, they found it the final altar, surrounded by 4 stone pillars, each one pointed in the cardinal directions. The altar itself was simple but imposing, covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. In the center lay the body of the latest victim, already beginning to harden into obsidian, his chest cracked open where Teo had attempted to carve out his heart. Teo was there, standing before the altar, his hands raised to the sky in a twisted prayer. His eyes were wild, filled with the fervor of a zealot, as he muttered in a language that wasn't human. The wind howled louder now, the sky above them darkening, swirling with unnatural energy. The volcano rumbled beneath them, and Valeria felt the earth tremble once again. The mountain was waking up. It was angry, and Teo had fed it perhaps too much. "Teo!" Valeria shouted, her voice breaking through the storm. "Stop this! It's not the way! The volcano, it will destroy everything." Teo turned slowly, his lips curling into a smile that was more manic than joyous. "You don't understand, Valeria. The ritual must be completed. The 4 winds must be aligned. Only then can the god be appeased. You can't stop it, you never could." The wind grew stronger, and the very air seemed to vibrate with energy. Valeria knew it was too late. The eruption was imminent. But something else had begun to stir beneath the surface, something far darker, far more ancient. Chapter 6. The Wrath of Shutekutli. The wind howled with a ferocity that seemed to shake the very air around them. As Valeria, Marco, and Itzel watched Teo from the edge of the altar, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble in warning. The volcano's rumblings were no longer distant, but close, as though the earth itself was groaning in pain. The sky above them had darkened into a deep, stormy gray, and a heavy cloud of ash began to descend from the peak, thickening the air with the smell of sulfur and molten rock. The eruption was imminent, and yet Teo remained still, his arms raised as if he were trying to touch the heavens themselves. "Teo!" Valeria shouted again, her voice barely audible over the deafening wind. "You have to stop this. The volcano will destroy everything, not just us." Teo's eyes were wild, consumed by a madness that Valeria had never seen in him before. His lips twisted into a grin that was both triumphant and unsettling. "You don't understand," he said, his voice a strange mix of reverence and obsession. "This is the will of the gods. The god of fire, Shutekutli, he demands this. The balance must be restored. Only then will the eruption cease. Only then will we survive." Valeria's chest tightened with dread. The name Shutekutli, the ancient god of fire, echoed in her mind, and she knew with a certainty that sent a chill down her spine that Teo's obsession had taken him to a place far beyond scientific reasoning. His belief in the ritual wasn't just an academic theory, it was his truth, and he had gone too far, far too far. Itzel, standing beside Valeria, shook her head slowly, her face pale with fear. "He is no longer Teo," she whispered, almost to herself. "He has become a vessel. The mountain has taken him. Jutekut speaks through him now. It's too late to stop the ritual. The eruption will come, and we cannot outrun it." Marco clenched his fists. "We can't just let him do this. We have to stop him. He's killing everyone, and he doesn't even realize it." But as Marco took a step forward, the wind seemed to push back, as though the mountain itself were warning him. The ground shuddered violently beneath their feet, and the air grew thick with the acrid scent of molten rock. Valeria felt the heat rising, a palpable pressure in her chest. They were running out of time. "Teo, listen to me." Valeria pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. This is madness. You're not appeasing a god. You're feeding the volcano, and it's going to consume everything in its path. Teo's gaze remained fixed on the altar, unblinking, as though he couldn't hear her, or worse, didn't care. His voice rose in a chant, the words in ancient Nahuatl rolling off his tongue with increasing urgency. Xutecutli, Lord of Fire and Flame, I offer this sacrifice in your name. Feed, and spare us your wrath. Feed, and we shall live. Feed, and we shall be spared. The sky above them rumbled ominously, and the ground began to quake with a deep, terrifying intensity. A massive fissure opened up beneath their feet, spitting out ash and steam, the violent tremors almost throwing them off balance. The volcano's eruption was no longer just a distant threat, it was happening. The earth itself was breaking apart. No! Valeria screamed, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a step forward, then another, determined to stop Teo before it was too late. But as she moved, the ground beneath her feet cracked, and a deafening roar echoed from the volcano's depths. A pillar of fire shot into the sky, and the eruption had begun. The air was filled with the sound of tearing earth and splintering rock as the mountain awoke in a cataclysmic fury. Teo didn't flinch. He continued his chant, lost in his trance, as though the eruption itself was the confirmation of his belief. But Valeria could feel the power of the volcano now, like a great beast waking from a long slumber. It was alive, and it was angry. Xutecutli's wrath was coming for them all. The sky was ablaze with fiery light as the eruption intensified. Lava poured from the crater in molten rivers, cutting off any possible retreat. The earth shuddered beneath them with every rumble of the volcano's rage, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Valeria could feel the air growing thicker, the oppressive weight of the ash cloud closing in around them. Teo! Marco shouted again, his voice barely carrying over the roar of the volcano. We have to get out of here. Now. But Teo didn't respond. His eyes remained locked on the altar, as though he were in some kind of trance, the words of the ancient ritual reverberating in his mind like a prayer he had to finish. The earth trembled again, and this time it was not just a rumble, it was a full-fledged roar, like the very heart of the volcano was about to burst open. Valeria's pulse raced as she realized the truth. It wasn't just the eruption they had to fear. Teo had opened a doorway, a conduit for Xutecutli's wrath. The ritual wasn't just a physical act, it was a spiritual one. And by completing it, Teo had invited the god into the world, allowing it to manifest in the physical realm. As the heat surged around them, Valeria's mind raced. There was no more time for reasoning with Teo. There was no more time to try to stop the ritual. They had to escape. They had to survive. But as she turned to leave, something in the sky caught her eye. A figure of pure fire and smoke, towering above the eruption like a living, breathing entity, appeared in the sky. It was Xutecutli, the god of fire, a monstrous, elemental force of nature. His face was a grotesque mask of flame, his eyes burning like the sun. The earth trembled in his presence, and the very air crackled with his fury. He had been awakened, and now there was no stopping him. Valeria felt a cold sweat break out across her body. The volcano was no longer a mountain, it was a god, and Xutecutli was angry. Run! Valeria screamed, her voice raw with terror. She grabbed Marco's arm and pulled him toward the edge of the summit. Itzel, already ahead of them, was sprinting toward the narrow path that would lead them down the mountain. The eruption was relentless, lava pouring from the crater in streams, engulfing everything in its path. The ground shook violently beneath them as they scrambled down the steep slope. The air was thick with ash, the heat unbearable, and the noise deafening. The eruption was in full force now, and the mountain was unleashing its fury on everything in its wake. The figure of Xutecutli loomed over them like a terrifying god of destruction, and as the heat intensified, Valeria realized one terrible truth. They weren't just running from the eruption, they were running from the wrath of a god. Chapter 7. The Map of the Fire's Veins. The roar of the eruption behind them seemed to shake the very earth, and yet the path forward was eerily quiet. As Valeria, Marco, and Itzel descended the treacherous slope, the weight of what they had just witnessed pressed down on their shoulders. The mountain was alive, its fury unleashed like a sleeping beast that had been poked and prodded too many times. But even as they stumbled forward, fighting to stay on their feet amidst the tremors, a cold knot twisted in Valeria's gut. The eruption, the fury of Shutacutli, it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. "We have to find a way out," Marco said breathlessly, his voice cracking under the strain of their descent. He glanced up at the ash-filled sky, the volcanic plume towering above them like a massive choking fist. "Before this whole place comes down on us." But Valeria wasn't listening. Her mind was racing, trying to connect the fragments of the puzzle she had been piecing together for days now. The codex, Teo's madness, the acid, the ancient rituals. The eruption had been inevitable, but something in her gut told her that the ritual Teo had performed, no, the ritual he had completed had opened something deeper, something more insidious. "Valeria, are you listening?" Marco's voice cut through her thoughts, and she blinked, coming back to the present. The urgency in his tone was enough to shake her from her reverie. He was right. They needed to survive. They needed to get off the mountain. The eruption would be all-consuming, but it wasn't just the volcano's wrath they had to worry about. Something else had been unleashed, something far older. "We have to go," she said firmly, brushing off the panic that had been creeping into her voice. But as they neared the lower ridges of the mountain, she felt a strange pull in her chest, as if something deep beneath them was calling. A whisper in the back of her mind, barely audible, but distinct enough to send chills down her spine. The veins of fire. Itzel had heard it too. "There are tunnels," she said suddenly, her voice soft, yet certain. "The ancient ones knew of them. The veins of fire. They are the lifeblood of the mountain. You've seen the veins, haven't you?" Valeria stopped, her heart racing. The words hit her like a cold wave. "What are you talking about?" Itzel's gaze seemed distant, her mind lost in a place between history and fear. The tunnels beneath the mountain, the map was hidden. In the codices, the Aztecs, our ancestors, used the tunnels to appease Xiuhtecutli, to offer sacrifices where the mountain's heart lies. The veins of fire are the passages through which the god's fury flows. They were used to calm him, to take away the sacrifice, to channel the wrath into the earth. Valeria's thoughts scrambled as she remembered the ancient symbols they had uncovered. The strange codex, the stone pillars arranged at the cardinal directions. But there was more. There had been talk of the tunnels, the sacred paths through which offerings were made, leading to the heart of the volcano. She had brushed it aside, thinking it was just superstition. But Itzel was speaking with a certainty that sent a ripple of fear through her. What if the volcano's wrath could be channeled? "If the tunnels are still open," Valeria whispered, staring into the ash-filled air, "we might be able to stop it. We need to get inside. We need to stop whatever Teo has triggered." Itzel nodded, her face grim. "The tunnels lead to the heart of the volcano, the very core of Xiuhtecutli's power. But once you're inside, you cannot escape without understanding the true nature of the ritual. It is not just a place of sacrifice. It is where the god's fury begins. To walk those paths is to walk into the god's fire." The urgency of their situation didn't allow them much time to think. The earth continued to shake, and above them, the volcano's eruption seemed to grow more violent by the minute. It was as if the entire landscape was buckling under the pressure. The air was thick with ash, and the sound of the eruption drowned out every other noise. A constant, maddening roar. "We don't have time to argue," Marco said, pulling Valeria from her thoughts. "If the tunnels are real, we need to get to them now, or we're all going to die here." His voice was strained, his eyes wide with fear, and Valeria could see the terror that had taken root deep in his heart. Itzel led them toward the base of the mountain, moving with a determination that felt almost otherworldly. She didn't hesitate, her movements sure, as if she had walked these paths before. Valeria followed, her mind still racing. Could the tunnels really be the key? Was it possible to contain Xiuhtecutli's fury? Or would they be walking into the very heart of the beast, only to be consumed by it? As they moved, Valeria's thoughts returned to Teo, his obsession, his madness, his belief in the god's power. He had known more than they realized, more than even the codices could tell them. It was almost as if he had been led to this moment. But why? What had driven him to invoke the wrath of Xiuhtecutli? Had he truly believed that he was saving the world? Or had he been seeking to release something that should have remained sealed within the mountain's core? The further they descended, the more the earth seemed to hum with energy, as if the very bones of the world were vibrating in response to the eruption. Itzel stopped at a rocky outcrop and pointed toward a narrow opening just below them. It was obscured by thick vines and jagged rocks, but the outline was unmistakable. A cavern hidden beneath the mountain, waiting to be opened. "This is it," Itzel said. Her voice had taken on a strange reverence. "The entrance to the veins of fire. It is said that only those who understand the power of the mountain can pass through. The others—" She didn't finish the sentence. Valeria felt the weight of her words settle like a stone in her stomach. The idea of stepping into the veins of fire, where ancient power had once been used to calm Shutakutli's wrath, felt like an impossible task. But there was no turning back now. They had no choice but to enter. With a deep breath, Valeria stepped toward the cavern. The shadows within it seemed to beckon, and the faint glow of molten rock beyond the entrance cast an eerie light on the walls. The moment they stepped inside, the temperature rose dramatically, and the hum of the earth beneath them became a deafening thrum. It was as if the very mountain was alive, pulsing with energy, its veins running with fire. And as they ventured deeper into the bowels of the volcano, Valeria couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer in control of their fate. They had opened a door to something far older, far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. The map of the veins was no longer a guide. It was a path to their doom. Chapter 8. The Deception of the God. The moment they stepped into the cavern, the air around them thickened, charged with a palpable energy. It felt as though the very walls were watching them, the faintest tremors running through the ground beneath their feet. Valeria's breath came in short, sharp bursts as she took in the narrow passageway before her. The walls were slick with moisture, but as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she could see that the rock was not just stone. There was something else, something that shimmered beneath the surface, a faint, ethereal glow that made the cavern feel less like an earthly place and more like the inside of some forgotten, living creature. "We're not alone," Marco whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. The air was thick with the sound of their footsteps, but there was something else, a strange, almost imperceptible hum, like a voice murmuring just out of reach. It made the hairs on the back of Valeria's neck stand on end. Itzel didn't respond, but she moved forward with grim determination, her steps steady and sure. "The tunnels are alive," she said quietly, her voice almost reverent. "They have been here long before us, long before the Aztecs even. The God's will flows through them. The heat, the power, it's not just a force of nature. It's a consciousness, a mind that bends the mountain to its desires." Valeria's heart beat faster. The more Itzel spoke, the more she began to understand just how far gone Teo truly was. It wasn't simply a matter of him being obsessed with an ancient god, no. It was far worse. The god was real. Shutakutli wasn't a relic of history. He was alive. And Teo had been playing with fire, literally and figuratively, when he invoked the god's power. They walked deeper into the cavern, each step heavier than the last, as if the weight of the mountain itself was pressing down on them. The heat in the air was growing unbearable, the humidity thickening. But it wasn't the heat from the volcano that unsettled Valeria. It was the presence that seemed to pulse through the rocks, the way the walls hummed like they were alive, breathing with an ancient, malevolent purpose. At the far end of the passage, a large chamber opened up, revealing a breathtaking and horrifying sight. The walls were lined with veins of glowing orange rock that pulsed with an almost sentient energy. In the center of the room was a massive altar, carved from the rock itself, with intricate glyphs and symbols that Valeria recognized from the codices they had studied earlier. The altar was stained dark with what appeared to be old, dried blood, but it was the object atop it that caused Valeria's breath to catch in her throat. A single stone idol stood in the center of the altar, its form twisted and deformed, but unmistakable. It was Shutekutli, the god of fire. But this was not the dignified god of the ancient texts, nor the ceremonial representations they had seen before. No, this idol was monstrous, its face contorted in agony, its body made of twisted rock and molten veins, as though it had been hewn directly from the core of the volcano itself. The air around it shimmered with heat, and as Valeria stared at it, she could almost hear the god's whisper in the back of her mind. Feed me, and I will grant you power. Marco stepped forward, his face pale. This isn't just an idol. This is him. Shutekutli, the god himself. Itzel's eyes were wide, and her voice was filled with awe and fear. Yes, the god's true form. He is not a god that exists above us, in some faraway heaven. He is the fire beneath our feet, the force that drives the mountain, that makes the earth tremble. He has always been here, feeding on the blood of the earth. And Teo, he didn't just awaken him. He brought him here. Valeria felt a chill run down her spine. She had been so focused on stopping the eruption, on finding a scientific explanation for the deaths and the petrified bodies, that she had overlooked something far more sinister. The god was not just a symbol of destruction, he was the source of it. And Teo's belief, his obsession, had unlocked something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The ritual, Valeria whispered, her mind piecing the puzzle together. Teo didn't just think he was appeasing the god. He was trying to bind him here, to bring his power into the world. But why? Why would he want to do that? It's the ultimate power, Itzel said, almost to herself. The power to control fire, to control the earth itself. It's why the ancient priests performed their sacrifices here, in the heart of the mountain, to keep the god satisfied, to prevent him from turning his wrath on the world. But Teo, he believed he could control it. He thought he could use Yutekutli's power to save the world, or to transform it. But he has made a grave mistake. The god cannot be controlled. He feeds on blood, on life. And once he is unleashed, he cannot be bound. Marco's eyes widened. So Teo, he didn't just want to stop the eruption. He wanted to use it to control Shutekutli? Itzel nodded grimly. Yes, and in doing so, he has made himself an offering, a sacrifice. Her eyes flicked to the altar, where the idol loomed, its molten veins flickering like fire. The god is not bound to this world by a simple ritual. He exists as a force, a consciousness, a primal hunger. And Teo's attempt to control him has only freed him. Shutekutli is here now awake, and the world will burn. A sickening realization hit Valeria like a punch to the gut. Teo's descent into madness had opened a doorway that was not just a physical space, but a temporal one. The eruption wasn't just an eruption of molten rock, it was a release. A release of the god's power, and the rituals they had uncovered were only the beginning. The worst was yet to come. There's no way back, Valeria said quietly, the weight of the truth sinking in. We're too late. The volcano's fury, it's not just about fire and lava anymore. It's about the god himself, and he's awake. He will burn the world. They stood in the chamber, surrounded by the pulsating glow of the idol, the hum of the earth's power vibrating in the air around them. The god had been freed, and there was no turning back. Shutekutli was no longer a distant deity in ancient texts. He was here, with them, and he wanted more than just blood. He wanted life. He wanted everything. Marco took a step back, his face pale, his hand trembling. Then what do we do now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Valeria didn't answer right away. She had no answers. All she knew was that they were running out of time, and the god Shutekutli wasn't the only thing that was hungry. The mountain itself had begun to stir, its deep rumbling signaling that the final phase of the ritual was about to begin. And when it did, there would be no survivors. Chapter 9. The immolation. The air inside the cavern was suffocating, thick with heat and the acrid smell of sulfur that seemed to come from every corner. The glow of Shutekutli's idol illuminated the chamber in a molten hue, casting long shadows that danced and twisted like serpents in the firelight. Valeria's mind raced as the weight of their discovery settled over her. They were not just in the heart of a volcano, they were standing at the threshold of something ancient, something alive, and it was awakening, its power unfurling like a storm on the horizon. Teo had known this. He had known all along what would happen if he succeeded in awakening the god. And now, standing in the depths of the mountain, Valeria realized just how deep his obsession had gone. He hadn't just been a geologist. He had become something else, an apostle, a believer, a servant of Shutekutli. He had seen the volcano as a means of salvation, not destruction. But in his madness, He had underestimated the god's hunger. Teo, Valeria muttered under her breath. The thought of him, of his twisted belief in the power of the god, made her blood run cold. She turned to Itzel, but her guide's face was a mask of fear and awe. Itzel's knowledge had led them here, but now, even she seemed to be caught in the gravity of the situation. The ancient ritual had been incomplete, yes, but the god was no longer dormant. He was awake, and he was hungry. We have to stop him, Valeria said, the words escaping her lips with an urgency that surprised even her. Teo, he's gone too far. We need to find him. Itzel nodded, her eyes scanning the chamber as if searching for something in the walls themselves. He is here, she said softly, almost reverently. Teo has become part of this place. He has offered himself to the god. Valeria's stomach turned. She hadn't considered the possibility that Teo might have gone so far as to merge himself with the power of Shutekutli. The idea that Teo, in his madness, could have given his body his very essence to the volcano itself was almost too horrifying to grasp. But there it was, his name was now tied to the god's fury. There was a sudden, deafening roar from deep within the heart of the mountain. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the chamber seemed to quake with the force of the eruption that was coming, that was already here. Itzel gasped and looked at Valeria, her face pale. He's begun the final stage of the ritual, the immolation. Valeria felt a chill sweep over her. The immolation. The word echoed in her mind like a death knell. The final stage of Teo's ritual, the sacrifice. The offering of life to the god to ensure his favor, to calm the beast before it consumed everything in its path. But what if this time, the ritual wasn't to calm the god? What if it was to release him completely? We have to stop it, Valeria said, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. She had to find Teo, to stop whatever he was planning, but as she looked around, she realized there was no clear path forward. The tunnels seemed to stretch endlessly, an unmarked labyrinth that wound deeper into the heart of the mountain. The air around them was growing hotter, the temperature climbing rapidly. Sweat beaded on Valeria's forehead as she wiped it away with her sleeve. The walls seemed to be closing in, the very stone itself radiating a heat that felt unnatural. And then, from the depths of the mountain, she heard something that made her blood run cold, a whisper, low and guttural, like a voice carried by the wind through the rocks. Feed me, and I will give you power. Valeria froze. The voice was coming from the idol, from Shutekutli. The god wasn't just speaking to Teo, he was speaking to them. Itzel's face twisted in a look of terror. He wants a final offering. The god, he feeds on sacrifice. He always has. At that moment the earth shook again, and the chamber seemed to split open before them. A great rift appeared in the stone, jagged and wide, as though the very mountain itself was splitting open. The ground cracked, and from the depths below, a torrent of molten rock began to rise, flowing like a river of fire toward the center of the chamber. It was as though the god himself was descending, his power erupting in violent waves. The volcano is alive, Itzel whispered, almost in awe. It is feeding, just as Utukutli feeds. The immolation is not just a ritual. It is the moment the god claims what he has been promised. Valeria's heart thundered in her chest as the molten river of lava crept closer to the altar. There was no time left. Teo had already begun the immolation, and now the mountain was responding. The eruption wasn't just a natural disaster, it was part of a larger plan, a cataclysmic offering to the god that would reshape everything. We can't let this happen, Valeria said, her voice tight with panic. She turned to Marco, who had been silent for far too long. We need to find Teo now. He's the only one who can stop this. But Marco was staring at the molten river, his face pale. How can we stop something that is already happening? The god is here. The mountain is awake. The only thing left is the sacrifice. Valeria felt her hands shake as she clenched them into fists. She had to act. They were running out of time. The god was awakening, and his fury was beginning to take physical form. Teo's madness had freed him, and now the mountain was about to collapse under the weight of the god's power. There was only one way to stop it, to face Teo head-on, to disrupt the ritual before it reached its culmination, to stop the immolation before the god could claim his final offering. As Valeria made her way toward the altar, her heart pounding, she felt the heat rise to an unbearable level. The god's presence loomed over them, heavy and suffocating. She had no idea if they could stop the ritual or if they would even survive it, but there was no other choice. They had to try, and with every step she took toward Teo, toward the altar, she knew that the fate of the world hung in the balance. The immolation had already begun, and if they failed, if they didn't stop Teo, the god would consume everything in his path. Chapter 10. The cry of the volcano. The earth trembled beneath Valeria's feet, the sound of cracking stone reverberating through the cavern like thunder. The molten river of lava surged forward, creeping closer to the altar, to Shutekutli's idol, as though the very mountain was alive, ready to swallow them whole. Valeria's pulse raced in her ears as she watched the fire crawl toward the offering, toward the god's insatiable hunger. Sweat beaded on her forehead, stinging her eyes, but she didn't dare wipe it away. Time was running out. Behind her, Itzel and Marco were struggling to keep up, their faces pale with fear. But Valeria knew they had no choice but to move forward. They had to find Teo. He was the key to everything, the only one who could end the madness he had set in motion. But where was he? The cavern was vast, winding into tunnels that disappeared into the darkness, and in every direction, the ground seemed to be shifting, alive with the god's power. Valeria's breath came in short gasps as she moved faster, her boots pounding against the uneven stone floor. The whispers, the voices of the volcano grew louder in her mind, echoing through the walls, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers weren't just in her head anymore. They were coming from everywhere, from deep within the mountain itself, a chorus of agonized voices chanting in an ancient guttural language that made her skin crawl. She turned a corner, and there, in the distance, she saw him, Teo. He stood at the edge of the molten river, his figure silhouetted against the flickering orange glow of the lava. His eyes were wide, his expression rapturous, as if he were in the midst of some spiritual ecstasy. In his hand he held a jagged obsidian dagger, its sharp edge gleaming in the firelight. His lips moved, whispering words that Valeria couldn't hear, but she didn't need to. She knew what he was doing. He was calling to the god, offering his final sacrifice. Itzel's voice broke the silence. "We have to stop him. Now." Valeria didn't hesitate. She surged forward, her heart hammering in her chest, but as she drew closer, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. Teo wasn't just standing there, offering himself to the god. He was merging with the volcano. The ground around him trembled, and Valeria could see the dark veins of lava beginning to pulse from beneath the surface, wrapping around his legs like tendrils of fire, pulling him deeper into the earth. He was becoming part of the mountain, part of the god's power. "Teo!" Valeria shouted, her voice breaking through the chaos of the eruption. "Stop! You don't know what you're doing." Teo's eyes flicked to her, but there was no recognition in them, only a blank, vacant stare, as if he were no longer fully human. "The god has awakened," he whispered, his voice hoarse but filled with reverence. "He calls to me. I must answer. I must become him." Valeria's stomach churned as she realized the full extent of his madness. He wasn't just trying to control the god, he had become the sacrifice. He was willingly offering his body, his soul, to merge with Shutekutli, to be consumed by the volcano's power. And once he did, there would be no turning back. "We can't let this happen," Valeria said, her voice desperate. "Teo, you have to fight it. You don't know what you're doing. The god doesn't want to control you. He wants to consume you. He will destroy everything." Teo's face twisted in a strange smile, and he shook his head. "You don't understand. The eruption is not just a force of nature. It is the god's will, his manifestation. I am the vessel. I am the bridge between worlds." The lava surged violently, as if answering his words. The ground split open beneath him, and the heat intensified, so hot that Valeria could feel her skin blistering from the proximity. Marco grabbed her arm, pulling her back, but Valeria's eyes remained fixed on Teo. He was being consumed, his body slowly sinking into the molten earth, the fire curling around him like a serpent. His form was dissolving into the flames, becoming one with the mountain, as though the very earth was swallowing him whole. "No!" Valeria cried out, but it was too late. The transformation was complete. Tio was gone, lost to the god's power. But even as she stood there, heartbroken and horrified, Valeria could hear the god's voice, the voice of Shutakutli reaching her mind, a low, guttural rumble that reverberated through her bones. The sacrifice is complete. The god awakens. The ground shook violently as the eruption began in earnest. The volcano had been dormant for centuries, its power waiting to be unleashed. But now, with Teo's sacrifice, it was awake, angry, and hungry. The lava poured from the rift, flooding the cavern, and Valeria could see the sky above turning black with smoke, the air thick with the acrid scent of sulfur. The mountain itself seemed to be alive, its veins of fire stretching up to the heavens, as though the very earth was giving birth to destruction. "We have to leave," Itzel said, her voice filled with terror as she grabbed Valeria's arm. "It's too late. We have to run before it consumes us all." But Valeria couldn't move. She stood frozen, watching as the mountain erupted, as the fire spread like a tidal wave, swallowing everything in its path. The god's will had been set into motion, and there was no stopping it now. The ritual had been completed, and the world would burn. "Run!" Marco shouted, his face pale as he pulled Valeria toward the exit. But Valeria was too lost in the horror of what had just happened to move. She had failed. They had all failed. As they fled down the winding tunnels, the roar of the volcano's fury filled their ears, and the heat grew unbearable. The god had awakened, and nothing could stop him now. The cry of the volcano echoed through the earth, a sound of primal rage that would not be silenced until everything was consumed by flame. And as the mountain rumbled beneath them, Valeria realized that they weren't just running from the eruption, they were running from the god himself.